Picture the northern German plain, not as it looks today, crisscrossed with autobahns and wind turbines, but as it was nearly 2,000 years ago. A land of bog and mist, where the ground squelched beneath every step, and forests pressed in close, their trunks dark with moisture, their canopies sheltering flocks of crows. It was not, to be frank, the sort of place you'd pick for a holiday cottage. But for the Saxons, this strange mixture of mud timber and waterlogged soil was home, and from it they would forge an identity so strong that its echo still resounds in the very word Saxon, a name that has endured far longer than many of the empires they once defied. They began in Holstein and Westphalia, and in the broad sweep of heathland we now call Lower Saxony. These were not glamorous landscapes, no glittering marble cities, no amphitheaters, no tiled baths, like their Roman neighbors enjoyed further south. Instead, there were rivers, the Weser, the Elbe, the Ems, rivers that twisted through marshes and carved valleys, rivers that served as highways long before stone roads ever reached this far. Imagine young Saxon children skipping stones across the water while their elders eyed the current, already planning where to build their elevated houses so the spring floods wouldn't sweep everything away. Those houses were marvels of practicality. Long timber frames stuffed with wattle and daub, thatched roofs, sloping like hunched shoulders against the North Sea winds. Inside, smoky fires smoldered, smoke curling upward to escape through tiny vents. Families clustered in warmth, their lives organized around the extended clan. You weren't just you were the son or daughter of so-and-so cousin, to half the village bound in a web of kinship and obligation that made survival possible. But what really stands out about the Saxons' homeland is how it shaped them into a people, both stubborn and restless. The marshes gave them fish and fowl, the forests gave them timber and game, and the rivers gave them pathways to travel. Yet those same rivers and wetlands cut their settlements into isolated pockets. Communities had to be self-sufficient, tough, and resourceful. Every storm might flood the fields, every winter might freeze the waterways. If you couldn't adapt, you didn't last long. And if you could adapt well, you might one day pack up, build a boat, and see what lay beyond the horizon. By the 1st century, AD archaeological digs show us Saxon villages perched on artificial mounds, lifted above the floodwaters like little islands. Each mound housed maybe 200 souls, sometimes as many as 500, a whole extended family, and their retainers living in one carefully planned community. At the center stood the Great Hall, a place for feasting, decision-making, and perhaps a bit of boasting after too much mead. Around it clustered smaller homes and workshops, smiths hammering iron, potters spinning clay, women weaving cloth dyed in earthy reds and yellows. Life was not luxurious, but it was rich in rhythm and tradition. And from these rhythms emerged identity. Though Saxon tribes had no single king or capital, they shared language, customs, and stories. They were bound less by hierarchy than by the shared understanding of who they were, where they came from, and which gods smiled or scowled upon them. Later chroniclers would try to pin down exact borders, but in truth, the Saxons were never confined by borders. They were a people of edges, the edge of the forest, the edge of the bog, the edge of the sea. And living on the edge does things to a culture. It makes you adaptable. It makes you fierce. And sometimes it makes you keen to test what lies on the other side. Of course, the Romans, peering nervously from their frontier forts along the Rhine, lumped these northern folk together as barbarians, hairy, loud, and frighteningly unpredictable. Yet if you look past the Roman prejudice, you'd see ingenuity. Elevated houses that resisted flooding, settlements that combined farming with craftwork, people who could turn swampy soil into farmland with a persistence only rivaled by Dutch engineers many centuries later. And importantly, you'd see a community where every man was expected to be both farmer and fighter. In the fields, one season, spear in hand the next. Survival demanded flexibility. Even the tools, blurred lines, and axe that cut wood by day could be swung as a weapon by night. Children grew up with both possibilities in their hands, the plowshare and the blade. It is easy, drifting here in the present, to imagine the Saxons as grim, mud-smeared figures endlessly trudging through bog water. But there was joy too. Feast days, when cattle were slaughtered, and the whole community ate until bellies ached. Seasonal festivals, when torches flared against the dark and voices lifted in song. And those rare, clear evenings, when if you stood on the sandy ridges of Lower Saxony and looked west, the sky would open over the sea, blazing with a sunset of bronze and crimson. Perhaps some young Saxon gazed out across those waters and wondered, what if there's something more over there? That wondering spirit born of marsh and mist would carry the Saxons far indeed. But for now, in these early centuries, they remained in their homeland, honing their crafts, worshipping in their groves, raiding their neighbors, occasionally and quietly preparing for the centuries of upheaval to come. Their roots were deep tangled, like the tree roots that gripped the boggy earth, and from those roots a mighty people would grow. If you'd wandered into a Saxon settlement in the 3rd or 4th century, you wouldn't have found a palace or a parliament building. No golden throne rooms or marbled courts where senators argued in Latin. Instead, political power was more portable. It might be found beneath the canopy of an oak tree in the middle of a muddy clearing, where free men gathered with their weapons laid across their knees. That gathering was the tribal assembly. It was not glamorous, but it was the heartbeat of Saxon political life. Imagine it men calling out across a noisy circle, voices competing, sometimes laughing, sometimes growling. Disputes settled not by a robed magistrate, but by consensus persuasion and the occasional raised spear to punctuate a point. If you wanted to test your rhetorical skills, this was your stage. And if you lost the debate, well, at least there was usually feasting afterward. Politics tastes better when washed down with ale. This blend of democracy and warrior culture created a curious balance. On the one hand, there were aristocratic families, chieftains with prestige, the kind who traced their line back to mythical ancestors and carried swords inlaid with patterns that shimmered in the firelight. On the other hand, ordinary free men insisted on having their say. The thing might be convened at a sacred grove, or a hilltop places chosen not for comfort, but for spiritual weight. Decisions about war, peace, land, or punishment had to be made where the gods could hear. But the real glamour of Saxon life, if we can call it glamour, lay with the comitatus, the warrior bands. These were not state armies, nor were they drafted conscripts. They were circles of loyalty built around a charismatic leader. Picture a young man, restless and ambitious, pledging his life to a warlord in exchange for gifts, honor, and most importantly, glory. The bond wasn't just contractual, it was sacred. Oaths were sworn weapons exchanged, and a kind of chosen brotherhood formed. In these bands, birth mattered less than bravery. A clever farm boy who fought like a wolf might find himself rising in rank, gaining weapons of finer make, and sitting closer to the leader's fire. For a society that often seemed frozen in its hierarchies, the warband was a ladder offering advancement to those willing to risk everything in battle. It also produced the stuff of legend. Each warband had its tales of raids, victories, and drunken feasts after near misses. If Hollywood had been around in the 3rd century, these would have been blockbuster sagas. Material culture confirms just how central warfare was. Archaeologists uncover Saxon graves furnished with spears, shields, even swords, costly treasures. Some shields bore intricate patterns their bosses polished to a gleam, and those swords, pattern welded with rippling designs in the steel, beautiful as much as deadly. To be buried with such a weapon was the ultimate sign of status proof that you'd lived and fought like a man of worth. Still, life wasn't all spear and shield. The Saxons were craftsmen of notable skill. Pottery blended local designs with Roman influences. Jewelry filigree brooches, arm rings showed artistry that rivaled their neighbors. The Romans might sneer and call them barbarians, but you don't forge a sword with flowing steel patterns if you're a simple brute. Somewhere, a Saxon smith's soot on his face and sweat on his brow was creating pieces that combined utility with art. This interwoven world of assemblies and warbands also meant politics was rarely straightforward. A chieftain couldn't simply command, he had to persuade, reward, and inspire. A leader who grew stingy or cowardly quickly lost his followers, who might drift away to another warlord more generous with treasure or more daring in raids. Loyalty was precious, but it had to be constantly renewed with gifts of gold, arm rings, and feasting. Forget to pass the mead horn to your warriors often enough, and suddenly your tent might feel emptier next winter. And yet, this system created resilience. There was no single point of failure. If one leader fell, the tribe did not collapse. Men could shift allegiance, regroup, and fight again. The Saxon Confederation was like a braided rope strands, twisting sometimes, fraying but holding together with surprising strength. That is why Rome, for all its legions and fortifications, found the Saxons maddening. You could defeat one warband, burn one village, but the spirit of independence flowed on, gathering in the next thing, binding the next generation of young men to the cause. In these muddy gatherings and smoky halls, Saxon society found its rhythm. Law was not written down, but spoken, remembered, and argued. Justice might be a matter of compensation, cattle for a wronged family, or silver for a slain kinsman. Reputation mattered more than paper. Break your oath, and you were finished. Keep it even unto death, and your name might echo in song long after your bones rested beneath the earth. So the Saxons, with their things, and warbands with their smiths and orators, carved out a system unlike the empire to their south. Decentralized, noisy, fiercely personal, and in its way, astonishingly effective. From this rough democracy and dangerous brotherhood grew the traditions that would carry them far across seas and centuries. When we step into the religious world of the Saxons, we enter a place at once earthy and mysterious. Forget the polished marble temples of Rome or the orderly colonnades of Greece. Saxon religion lived in the open air. Their cathedrals were groves of oak, their altars the flowing streams, and their priests men who spoke with conviction beside firelight while the wind carried their words into the branches above. It was a faith rooted in soil and sky and mist and storm, in the rhythms of harvest and war. To the Saxons, the sacred was never far away. It was tangled in the roots of the trees, whispered by the rivers, and staring down at them from the night sky. At the center of it all was weird, a concept often translated as fate, but far richer than any one English word can capture. Weird was the unseen current pulling at every life, a reminder that no matter how brave you were with a spear, or how eloquent in the thing, destiny had its say. Imagine living with that idea always close, that your deeds mattered, not just for today, but for how your name would be remembered after Weird had claimed you. In a way, it was freeing. You could stride into battle, axe raised, knowing that what would be would be. At least you'd look heroic doing it. The pantheon of the Saxons resembled that of their Germanic cousins, with gods who embodied storm war wisdom and fertility. Woden, whom we might recognize as Odin, stood tall as the god of kingship, and Battle the one who whispered to leaders and demanded courage. Thunor, with his booming hammer, controlled thunder and storms, both a literal and metaphorical force. Frigg, goddess of home and fertility, balanced the martial with the domestic. These were not distant deities, cloistered in heaven. They were woven into the everyday. A failed harvest. Perhaps Frigg was displeased. A lightning strike on the hall roof Thunor had made his opinion known. A chieftain's unexpected victory. Surely Woden had tilted the scales. But gods were not always worshipped in polite ceremonies. They were courted, bargained, with sometimes even defied. Archaeologists digging in Saxon bogs have found hordes of weapons deliberately broken and deposited into the water, as though the tribes had said to the spirits, "Here we give up what is most valuable to us. In return, bless our fields and our families." To throw away a perfectly good sword into a swamp is no small gesture. It's a little like hurling your brand new iPhone into a pond today, not an accident, but an act of faith that something unseen was watching and keeping score. Burial customs give us further glimpses of the Saxon soul. For generations, cremation was common bodies, burned ashes placed into urns, then buried in large cemeteries, where whole communities lay together across the centuries. Yet some graves were marked by ship-shaped stone settings, or even included horse burials, symbols of mobility journeys, and perhaps the hope that death was a voyage to another shore. Elite graves might contain weapons, jewelry, imported goods from far-off lands. Meanwhile, the graves of ordinary folk held simpler items: a pot, a comb, maybe a knife. But even those humble inclusions whispered belief. The dead still needed tools, still lived in some form, still traveled in the mysterious beyond. We mustn't imagine Saxon faith as purely somber, however. Festivals punctuated the year, and though their exact rituals are lost to us, echoes survive in later traditions. Midwinter celebrations, Yule blended feasting fire and gift-giving, all to push back the cold and honor the ancestors. Spring festivals burst with fertility rites, marking the return of life to fields and herds. Harvest festivals gave thanks, with communities gathering to share in abundance before the long months of scarcity. In each of these moments, religion was not abstract philosophy. It was an excuse to gather, eat, drink, and reaffirm the bonds that tied them together. If you've ever been at a lively family holiday meal, where food, laughter, and the occasional argument mix in equal measure, you've glimpsed something of what these festivals meant. Saxon rituals often took place in groves, where trees themselves became pillars of sacred space. Oaks were especially revered, their strength and longevity symbols of divine power. Springs, too, held holiness, bubbling water, seen as gifts of unseen forces. Sacrifices were offered here sometimes, animals, sometimes weapons, and perhaps, though evidence is fragmentary, sometimes people. It's a detail that fascinates modern minds, but should not overshadow the broader truth that for the Saxons, every bend in a river, every hill crowned with stones, could be a portal to the divine. This intimate spirituality shaped their society in ways subtle and profound. Leaders needed not just military skill, but religious legitimacy. A warlord might claim victory because Woden had favored him. A community might gather for a thing in a sacred grove precisely because law and religion were inseparable. To ignore the gods was to risk disaster, not just crop failure or sickness, but social collapse. If the divine was not honored, how could oaths mean anything? And in a society built on oaths, that was unthinkable. And yet this deep-rooted paganism also carried seeds of adaptability. When Christianity began to creep in, it did not erase these instincts, but reinterpreted them. Churches often rose on old sacred sites. Saints replaced gods in protecting fields and families. A Saxon might kneel at a cross one day, then quietly whisper, "Thanks to Woden," the next, hedging spiritual bets. Old habits, after all, die hard, especially the ones bound up with food fire and survival. There's a curious humor in imagining it. A Saxon farmer in the 6th century standing at his plow, muttering, "Lord bless this field. Woden you too. Frig maybe keep the pigs healthy. And hey, if the new Christian priest is right, then may Christ also lend a hand." When survival is at stake, spiritual multitasking is a wise strategy. Ultimately, what shines through in all of this is how the Saxons saw the world as alive with meaning. The rustle of leaves in the forest could be a god's whisper. The sudden break of thunder might be Thunder's judgment. Even death was not final, but a passage accompanied by gifts and memories to some other hall where warriors feasted forever. In their worldview, courage mattered because life was fleeting. Loyalty mattered because weird was relentless. Generosity mattered because feasting and gift-giving bound the community against the chaos that lurked beyond the firelight. As we drift into sleep with these Saxons, it's worth pausing on that last image of people gathered in a grove fire flickering on their faces, voices raised in chant and song, weapons gleaming with reflected flame. Behind them, the dark forest waits, and above them, the stars glimmer coldly. In that moment, you can almost hear the heartbeat of their faith, a rhythm as old as the trees and as enduring as the language they left behind. Close your eyes and picture the Saxon shoreline in the 3rd century, the gray expanse of the North Sea, restless and cold, its waves breaking against reed-fringed inlets and shifting sands. On the horizon, dark silhouettes of long, narrow boats bob in the surf. They are crude compared to the Roman galleys patrolling the channel, but they have something Rome's heavy warships lack: speed, agility, and a crew of men who have spent their entire lives listening to the moods of the sea. This was the moment when the Saxons transformed from a people rooted in marsh and meadow to a people feared upon the waves. Their environment had been nudging them in this direction for generations. Living on a coastline riddled with estuaries and rivers, they had long used boats for fishing, ferrying, and trade. But by the late Roman period, those humble craft had evolved into something more menacing. Archaeological finds, boat graves, ship-shaped stone monuments hint at vessels sleek enough to skim across the open sea, shallow enough to slip up rivers, and sturdy enough to survive the North Sea's fury. The Romans, ever practical, were among the first to record this change. Around 150 AD, Ptolemy's geography listed the Saxons and Holstein, identifying them as distinct neighbors among the Germanic patchwork. At first, they were just one tribe among many. But by the 3rd century, Roman sources began muttering nervously about Saxons showing up where they weren't invited. Coastal villas in Gaul, prosperous ports in Britain, suddenly they were being visited by uninvited guests, arriving at dawn, leaving smoke and confusion behind. To the Saxons, raiding must have felt like an extension of skills they already possessed. They knew the tides, the shallows, and the art of rowing in rhythm. Their shallow draft boats could beach on almost any patch of sand, disgorge warriors, and vanish again before a proper Roman force could arrive. Imagine the shock of a wealthy Roman villa owner awakened by shouts rushing outside in his toga, only to see shadows with spears slipping back into the sea, the granaries already burning. By the mid-3rd century, these raids had become so frequent that Rome coined a term, the Saxon Shore. No, not a trendy holiday destination with guest houses and seashell souvenirs, but a desperate line of coastal forts stretching from Kent to the Isle of Wight, mirrored by similar defenses in Gaul. The logic was clear. If Saxons are going to raid, best to have fortifications ready. Roman engineers built thick-walled forts at places like Richborough-Pevensey and Portchester, their walls rising 20 feet high, strong enough to resist a sudden onslaught. But here's the irony. While the forts were designed to repel Saxons, they also gave Saxons valuable lessons. Watching Roman defenses, Noting harbor layouts, observing garrison routines, they learned as much as they plundered. In the classroom of the Roman frontier, the Saxons received a crash course in how empires defended themselves, and just as importantly, how empires grew tired and weak. And Rome was tired. By the 3rd century, the empire was staggering through crises, civil wars, economic chaos, plagues, invasions. Garrisons were pulled from the frontiers to fight elsewhere. Once imposing defenses along the Rhine and Channel began to fray. To Saxon eyes, this must have looked like an invitation. Why stay in the soggy homeland when wealthier, softer lands lay just across the water? The raids grew bolder, no longer just a handful of boats targeting isolated villas, but coordinated fleets striking in multiple places. Roman chroniclers complained of Saxon pirates swarming like wasps, knowing precisely when tides were lowest and which coastlines were weakest. These weren't reckless dashes, they were strategic, calculated, and often devastating. The economic impact was severe. Coastal towns shrank as merchants abandoned risky sea routes. Prosperous villas fell into ruin. Trade networks were disrupted. Rome's once confident grip on the Channel began to feel slippery, not because Saxons had greater armies, but because they wielded mobility like a weapon. If you've ever tried to swat a mosquito buzzing around your head at night, you'll understand the Roman frustration, individually small, but impossible to pin down, and capable of leaving a sting. Of course, the relationship between Rome and the Saxons wasn't always purely hostile. Trade still flowed. Roman coins, glassware, and luxury goods have been unearthed in Saxon settlements. A chieftain might raid one year, then trade the next, using Roman silver to buy prestige gifts for his followers. And sometimes, Rome even hired Saxons as federati allied troops paid to fight Rome's other enemies. It's the kind of pragmatic arrangement that made sense at the time, but in hindsight feels a little like handing your house keys to the burglar because he promises not to rob you again. For now. Meanwhile, within Saxon society, these maritime adventures transformed culture. Ship burials and boat-shaped monuments proliferated. Raiding became not just a tactic, but a pathway to status. A young man who joined a warband swore loyalty and crossed the sea to plunder Roman estates might return with treasure stories and the admiration of his kin. His grave, furnished with a foreign coin or a weapon of Roman make, told the story. Here lies someone who looked beyond the marshes and seized fortune. Religion, too, bent toward the sea. If life was a voyage, then ships were symbols of destiny. A boat buried in the earth was not just a vessel. It was a spiritual guarantee, a way of ensuring the deceased could sail onward into the next world. Some graves show horses buried alongside men, a reminder that mobility by land or water was sacred. Fate was a journey, and the gods demanded you be well equipped for it. Rome's response naturally was to double down on defense. The Saxon shore forts were staffed with mixed garrisons of legionaries and naval troops, some of them possibly even Saxons themselves, who had signed on for Roman pay. Patrol fleets roamed the Channel. Watchtowers lit fires to signal approaching sails. Yet for all the effort, raids never ceased. The Saxons had found their calling, and the North Sea was their classroom-proving ground, and highway rolled into one. It's tempting to cast this as a clash of civilizations, mighty Rome versus scrappy Saxons, but in truth, it was more a dance. Attack, counterattack, trade, betrayal, invitation, rebellion. Over time, the Saxons grew not only richer, but more confident. Every raid that slipped past Roman defenses reinforced the notion that the old empire was not invincible. Every coin or glass goblet brought home became a reminder that beyond the sea lay wealth worth risking everything for. And so, by the time the 4th and 5th centuries dawned, the Saxons were no longer just occasional raiders. They were practiced seafarers, hardened pirates, and increasingly settlers who saw in Britain not just a target, but a place to build new homes. Their ships had carried them from marshland obscurity into Roman nightmares. And soon, those same ships would carry them into the heart of a collapsing empire, where opportunity and danger awaited in equal measure. For now, imagine those lean vessels slicing through the morning mist oars, biting into the water in unison, their crews wrapped in cloaks against the chill. A look passes among them, half hunger, half exhilaration. Ahead lies a Roman villa, fat with grain and gold. Behind them, their marshy homeland waits. The Saxons have become seafarers, raiders, and something else besides a people who are beginning to realize that the horizon is not a boundary, but an invitation. The 3rd and 4th centuries were not kind to the Roman Empire, and what shook Rome inevitably rippled outward to its neighbors, including the Saxons. Think of Europe at this time as a grand, overcrowded chessboard where pieces suddenly began sliding in unpredictable ways. Pressure from the East economic troubles in the center and cracks in the Western defenses all conspired to shuffle entire peoples across the map. And the Saxons, stubborn though they were in their marshland homes, could not remain untouched. First came the pressure of the land itself. Archaeologists, studying pollen grains, yes, tiny plant particles trapped in ancient mud, have shown us a story of overworked fields in Saxon territory. By the late 3rd century, forest clearance had reached new heights. Soils were stretched to exhaustion, and farmers were pushing into marginal lands where crops struggled to grow. Imagine a family cutting down the last patch of woodland near their village to make room for barley, only to watch the harvest fail year after year as the soil refused to cooperate. Add in the bitter irony of climate change, cooler, shorter summers, wetter winters, and suddenly food was no longer guaranteed. And as if that weren't enough, the sea added its own menace. Rising waters crept inland, swallowing coastal plots and turning fertile fields into salt marshes. Villages that had stood for generations were abandoned, leaving behind nothing but scattered post holes and tools frozen in the soil, as though the owners had walked away mid-sentence. You can picture the scene: families loading carts, muttering prayers to Woden, and moving inland, or increasingly eyeing the horizon and wondering what lay across the waters. Yet these natural challenges were only the first gusts in a gathering storm. To the east, something truly terrifying was happening. Horsemen fast and fierce were thundering westward from the Eurasian steppe. They were the Huns, and though they never reached Saxon lands directly, they acted like a set of dominoes tipped into motion. First, the Goths were pushed from the Black Sea region. Then the Goths shoved into other Germanic groups, who in turn pressed against their western neighbors. By the time this rolling avalanche of humanity reached the North Sea, the Saxons suddenly found their neighborhood a lot more crowded and a lot less secure. Here is where the Saxons' character truly showed itself. Many societies under such pressure crumbled or surrendered. The Saxons, however, adapted. They had already grown used to building elevated villages against floods. Now they elevated their entire way of life. Instead of clinging to every patch of boggy homeland, some communities simply packed up and left. Archaeological evidence shows entire villages deserted in an organized fashion, not the chaos of famine or plague, but a calculated decision. Whole communities dismantled their homes, carried what they could, and set off in search of new horizons. And where better to look than across the water? By this time, Saxon ships had evolved into vessels that could carry not only raiders, but families, livestock, and supplies. The same shallow hulls that let warriors beach for lightning raids could also ferry settlers to fresh river valleys in Britain or along the coast of Gaul. The sea, once a barrier, had become a highway. The Romans noticed. They weren't blind to what was happening. Their defenses along the Rhine and Channel, the proud frontier that had once been a wall of steel, were cracking. Garrison strength was dwindling as legions were pulled away to fight civil wars or defend Italy. Forts crumbled, patrols thinned, and the Saxons slipped through the gaps. At first, it was opportunistic raiding, a raid on a villa here, a market town there, but increasingly, it was something more enduring. These weren't just warriors testing their luck. They were communities probing, settling, planting. Picture a fleet of Saxon boats pulling up along the English coast. Instead of rushing back to the sea after looting, they linger. Women and children climb out. They drive stakes for new homes. They carve fields from the soil. What began as piracy shades into migration and then into colonization. For Rome, this was unnerving. For the Saxons, it was survival, dressed as opportunity. At home, those who stayed behind also changed. Social structures became more centralized, with powerful leaders rising from successful warbands. Wealth from raiding flowed back, strengthening chieftains and binding warriors to them. Specialists, shipwrights, navigators, smiths gained new prestige because without them, the great game of raiding and migrating could not continue. The Saxon Confederation, once loose and scattered, began to coalesce around leaders who proved they could seize opportunities across the sea. It's tempting to think of this transformation as a sudden upheaval, but really, it unfolded over decades, like the slow turning of a tide. A little more pressure from hungry mouths, a little more threat from Eastern migrants, a little more weakness from Rome. Together, these forces nudged the Saxons into motion, and once in motion, they never really stopped. There's something deeply human in it. They didn't set out with a master plan to conquer Britain or topple Rome. They simply looked at their waterlogged fields, listened to the hungry bellies of their children, and followed their instincts, build a boat sail out, see what can be found. In doing so, they stepped into history's fast lane, transforming from swamp dwellers on the margins into central players in the drama of a crumbling empire. And so, as the 4th century closed, the Saxons stood at a crossroads. Behind them lay their boggy homeland, familiar but failing. Ahead stretched the wide sea, promising danger, but also wealth and fertile fields. They had the ships, they had the warriors, and they had word, the sense that destiny was pulling them outward. It is here, in this crucible of crisis and opportunity, that the Saxons ceased to be just another Germanic tribe among many. They became something more, a people on the move, a people of the sea, a people whose future would be written not in the mists of the marsh, but in the green valleys of Britain, and eventually in the very language you are hearing now. Imagine Britain around the mid-5th century. The Romans, who had marched, paved, taxed, and lorded over the island for nearly 400 years, were gone. Their legions had marched away in 410, leaving behind a patchwork of Romano-British nobles who were suddenly discovering that inherited villas and fancy mosaic floors didn't necessarily translate into effective military leadership. The walls were crumbling, the coins stopped minting, and worse still, raiders from the North Picts and Scots were swooping down with unnerving regularity. For the British elites, it must have felt like watching the roof of your house collapse in slow motion while a storm gathered outside. Enter the Saxons, or rather, as the story goes, they were invited in. According to later chroniclers like Bede Britain's King, or Overking, as the sources sometimes imply, a man named Vortigern looked at the endless raids and thought, well, we could really use some muscle. And who better to hire than those hardy seafaring Germans already renowned for their fighting skills? Thus, in the legendary year of 449 AD, 2 brothers, Hengist and Horsa, arrived in Kent with 3 ships of warriors. Their names themselves practically announce their purpose. Hengist, meaning stallion, and Horsa, literally horse. You can almost hear a British noble muttering, "Ah yes, bring in stallion and horse. Surely nothing could go wrong." The deal, at least according to tradition, was straightforward. Vortigern granted them land in exchange for their swords. The Saxons would serve as mercenaries guarding Britain from northern raiders, while also enjoying a cozy new home in the rich valleys of Kent. For a time, it seemed a win-win. The Britons had warriors, the Saxons had fields, and Britain, at least temporarily, had fewer picks thundering down from Hadrian's Wall. But let's not pretend this was a casual business arrangement. Archaeology confirms that Germanic settlers began establishing permanent communities in Kent during this very period. Excavations at places like Fingalsham and Mucking show us entire villages springing up complete with women, children, and craftsmen. These weren't temporary military camps where warriors twiddled their thumbs waiting for the next raid. They were colonies, pottery styles carried straight from the continent, burial customs rooted in Saxon traditions, and settlement layouts that suggest long-term planning. The invitation, then, may have been only part of the story. Perhaps the Saxons were hired as allies, yes, but with families already in tow, they likely arrived intending to stay, whether Vortigern liked it or not. You don't bring grandma along if you're planning just a quick mercenary tour. The legends, however, add a delicious layer of drama. One tale has Hengist's daughter, Rowena, catching Vortigern's eye. At a feast, she hands him a golden cup and greets him with the famous words, "Wes Hall, Hlaford, be well, my lord." Whether from love-lust or political calculation, Vortigern supposedly married her, cementing his alliance with the Saxons. One imagines the native British nobles shifting uncomfortably in their seats while muttering into their wine goblets. First we bring in the Germans. Now we're marrying them, what next? Tension predictably followed. As more Saxons arrived, land grew scarce. Kent's fertile soil could only support so many mouths, and Saxon appetites were notoriously hearty. Agreements broke down. Vortigern found himself less a master and more a hostage to his guests. Conflict escalated into battles, with Saxons no longer content to defend Britain, but carving out dominion for themselves. The symbolism of this shift is profound. What began as a mercenary contract transformed into a colonization movement. The Saxons had crossed a threshold. They were no longer outsiders invited to help, but settlers determined to claim Britain as their own. And while Hengist and Horsa stand in the chronicles as archetypal founders, the reality was more complex. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Saxon communities established themselves along Britain's southern and eastern coasts, each one weaving new threads into the island's demographic fabric. Archaeology again provides texture. The graves of early settlers show a striking blend of martial and domestic life. Warriors buried with spears and shields lie alongside women adorned with brooches, beads, and household tools. Children, too, were included their small graves, testifying that these were not temporary encampments, but whole societies planting themselves into Britain's soil. And yet the legend of Hengist and Horsa endures because it captures the pivot point. It gives us characters to embody what was really a tidal movement of people. The brothers' very names, horse and stallion, evoke speed, strength, conquest, and yes, a touch of inevitability. If fate or Weird had decreed that Britain was to become a new Saxon homeland, then Hengist and Horsa were the horsemen carrying that destiny forward. There's a bittersweet humor in it, too. Imagine the awkward banquet conversations, Romano-British nobles praising the stalwart loyalty of their Saxon allies, while outside more ships were quietly unloading families and livestock onto British shores. Or the moment when Vortigern, besotted with Rowena, failed to notice that his guests were rapidly becoming his rivals. It's the kind of slow-motion political blunder that centuries later still makes historians shake their heads. By the time the 5th century closed, Saxons were no longer just hired help. They were landholders, neighbors, sometimes overlords. The British elite, who thought they were buying security, had instead invited transformation. The guests had taken up permanent residence, and they were not planning to leave. So we end this part with an image 3 Saxon ships sliding onto the Kentish shore in 449. Hengist and Horsa at the prow, warriors leaping onto sand with spears in hand. A British noble watches, relieved, thinking reinforcements have arrived. But behind those warriors, more ships are coming. Behind the swords, plows are waiting. And behind the mercenary, smiles, ambition glints. Britain had opened its gates, and the Saxons, once marsh dwellers of the North Sea, were stepping through into a new world that would soon bear their name. When the Saxons first stepped ashore in Britain, it might have seemed to the Romano-British elites that they had found a solution to their problem. Hire some tough Germanic warriors, point them north toward the Picts and Scots, and then return to the comforts of their mosaic dining rooms. But solutions, as history loves to remind us, have a way of turning into problems of their own. What began as an alliance soon soured, and Britain slipped into decades of fire and blood as Saxons and Britons tested one another's strength. The early sources, fragmentary, contradictory, sometimes more legend than fact, paint the story in strokes of both tragedy and myth. Bede, writing centuries later, described how Saxons multiplied like weeds and soon demanded more land than the Britons were willing to give. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells of betrayals, feasts turned into ambushes, and bitter wars. Archaeology adds its own testimony. Villages suddenly abandoned, hill forts refortified after centuries of disuse, layers of ash in old Roman towns. The Saxons had not come to be mercenaries forever. They came to stay. Clashes erupted quickly. At first, the Saxons carved out Kent as their foothold, but they were hungry for more. Romano-British leaders, men raised in the shadow of Rome, still clinging to the titles and manners of empire, found themselves scrambling. One name stands out: Ambrosius Aurelianus. Gildas, a monk, writing in the 6th century, remembered him as a nobleman who, alone by the grace of God, survived the storm. He became the rallying figure for those Britons unwilling to watch their island carved up by newcomers. Ambrosius was no ordinary warlord. Born of a Romanized family, possibly trained in Roman military methods, he carried with him the aura of legitimacy that older traditions still respected. He organized resistance, pulled together the scattered remnants of British authority, and at least for a time stemmed the Saxon tide. Archaeological evidence suggests that during his era, hill forts across western Britain, like Cadbury Castle in Somerset, were rearmed and reinforced. Their ditches deepened, their walls repaired. Britain had fallen back on its Iron Age defenses, manned now by descendants of Rome's subjects fighting desperately for survival. The battles of this era were fierce, personal, and messy. Imagine a British hill fort at dawn, mist clinging to the slopes as Saxon warbands climb the hill with shields locked. Spears whistle, axes bite into shields, and the roar of men echoes across the countryside. To the Saxons, these fights were opportunities to prove their courage, to earn land and loot. To the Britons, they were battles for home and hearth. No one was holding anything back. And here somewhere, in the haze of smoke and legend, emerges a figure we know all too well, Arthur. Not the shining knight of later romance, not the king in golden armor sitting at a round table, but a war leader whose story blurred history and myth. Some sources describe him as a dux bellorum, a commander of battles rather than a crowned king. Whatever his exact identity, the memory of a leader who won great victories against the Saxons lodged itself deep in the cultural memory. The most famous of these victories was the Battle of Mount Badon, around the late 5th or early 6th century. Gildas claimed it halted Saxon expansion for nearly a generation. Though its location is hotly debated, some place it in Wiltshire. Others in Wales, the symbolic weight remains clear. It was the moment when Britons pushed back the tide and reminded the newcomers that conquest would not come without cost. For those who fought, it must have been searing blood on the grass shield walls locking, and the smell of sweat and iron mixing with fear. For those who remembered it, became myth the day the Britons held their ground. Of course, the Saxons were not permanently stopped. Archaeological layers tell us they continued to expand, but more cautiously consolidating territories in the southeast and pushing slowly inland. Still, the legend of Arthur, whether as a single leader or a composite memory of many leaders, shows how desperate and determined Romano-British resistance was. In those tales of knights and dragons, we hear the echo of real battles fought with spears and axes, the real terror of villages burned, the real courage of men standing against the odds. The cultural clash of this era went beyond battlefields. Romano-British towns like Londinium shrank or were abandoned altogether, their stone streets grassing over their once busy marketplaces falling silent. In their place rose Saxon-style villages, timber halls, thatched roofs, clustered farms. The very look of Britain was being rewritten. To some, it must have felt like civilization collapsing. To others, it was simply transformation, old forms, dying new ones being born. And yet, life carried on. Even in the midst of war, people still sowed crops, baked bread, raised children. The tragedy of this time is not that people stopped living, but that they lived through constant fear of raids, at dawn, of fields torched at harvest of neighbors, disappearing into exile or slavery. If the Roman centuries had been the relative calm of a heavily taxed empire, the 5th and 6th centuries were the storm, unpredictable, violent, and raw. One can almost imagine the exhausted sigh of an old farmer in Britain around this time standing in a blackened field. The Romans took our taxes, the Saxons take our land, and word takes us all. A weary bit of humor in the face of endless uncertainty. But from this fire and sword, a new landscape was emerging. The Saxons, for all their ferocity, were no longer mere raiders. They were settlers, bringing families shaping fields and anchoring themselves to Britain's soil. The Britons, for all their resistance, were adapting too, sometimes fighting, sometimes making uneasy peace, sometimes intermarrying. Slowly, painfully, a new balance was being forged in the crucible of war. It is in this chaos that the stage was set for the rise of the Saxon kingdoms. From mercenaries to colonizers, from raiders to rulers, the Saxons were carving their place into Britain with axe and plow alike. And though the Britons fought valiantly, sometimes even gloriously, the tide of history was turning. Britain would never again be purely Roman, nor purely Celtic. It was becoming something else Anglo-Saxon. Out of the chaos of war and shifting alliances in post-Roman Britain, something remarkable began to take shape: kingdoms. Not yet the unified England we know today, but small, tough self-contained realms carved out of the land by Saxon warlords and their followers. Each was born from fire and struggle settlers, staking claims with their spears, then building halls, farms, and laws to make those claims last. These early Saxon kingdoms, Kent, Sussex, Essex, and eventually Wessex, were the seeds from which the tapestry of Anglo-Saxon England would grow. Let us begin with Kent, the first among them. Archaeology tells us the Saxons didn't simply squat on someone else's farmstead. They created new settlements with a striking degree of organization. Villages were carefully placed on river valleys. Fields measured out, cemeteries plotted with grim precision. The Kentish Saxons seem to have had a head start in state building. They weren't just warriors turned farmers. They were rulers in training. By the early 6th century, Kent's kings were issuing law codes. Imagine that in a land still reeling from Rome's departure, where so much had collapsed into confusion, Kentish kings were already writing down rules to govern everything from theft to compensation for injury. The first of these rulers, Ethelbert of Kent, stands out as a figure who blended the raw energy of Saxon warlordry with the subtle arts of diplomacy. He married a Frankish princess named Bertha, which sounds romantic, but was also a masterstroke of politics. Through her, he forged connections across the Channel, linking Kent to the Frankish world. This gave Kent prestige trade access and eventually Christian influence, since Bertha brought her religion and her priest with her. Kent's court became cosmopolitan by Saxon standards, a place where merchants, priests, and craftsmen mingled. In a way, Kent was the Saxons' test run at being something more than raiders. Sussex, the kingdom of the South Saxons, had a different flavor. Its roots lay in raw survival and martial grit. The archaeological record here tells a story of warrior burials and fortified sites, suggesting a society on constant guard. These were people still very much defined by their martial culture. Sussex kings built their authority less on polished law codes and more on control of territory and force of arms. Yet Sussex, too, carved out a place for itself, clinging to its patch of southern coastline and slowly spreading inland. Then there was Essex, the East Saxons. What made Essex distinctive was its position near the ruins of Roman Londinium. The Saxons who settled here encountered not just empty farmland, but the stone carcass of Rome's greatest city in Britain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle hints at their expansion, but archaeology tells the richer story: Saxon huts and workshops springing up in the shadow of abandoned Roman walls. Essex's Saxons appear to have been pragmatic, adopting some Romano-British techniques even as they pushed their culture forward. Their leaders likely didn't see themselves as inheriting Rome's mantle, but in a way that's exactly what they did. They filled the vacuum with new blood, new authority, new rhythms of life. And then perhaps the most consequential, Wessex, the West Saxons. At first, they were not the most powerful. They began as one of many Saxon groups pushing into the Thames Valley and beyond. Yet from these beginnings, Wessex would one day dominate the whole island. Their settlements show careful planning, and their leaders seemed unusually adept at turning loose coalitions of warriors into stable, centralized kingdoms. By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, places like Dorchester-on-Thames reveal communities not just eking out survival, but thriving villages with craft workshops, agricultural surpluses, and the early hints of ceremonial or political centers. It's easy to picture these first kings sitting in smoky timber halls, the firelight dancing off shields hung on the walls, surrounded by warriors' advisors and their retinues. Decisions were made over cups of mead oaths sworn by the glow of the hearth. The hall was not only a political center, but the heart of Saxon identity, the place where generosity and loyalty were displayed. A good king was one who gave gifts lavishly, kept his warriors fed and armed, and upheld justice among his people. A stingy king, by contrast, was doomed oaths, frayed quickly if treasure didn't flow. Each of these kingdoms bore the stamp of its environment and history. Kent's openness to the continent made it a gateway for new ideas. Sussex's defensive posture reflected its vulnerability to attack. Essex straddled old Roman spaces and new Saxon ones, becoming a place of cultural fusion. Wessex drew strength from fertile river valleys and shrewd leadership. Together, they marked the shift from scattered Saxon villages to structured political entities. Yet these were not peaceful little garden kingdoms. They were forged in rivalry, in constant battle with neighbors, both Saxon and British. Each expansion into a new valley meant displacing someone else, or negotiating, or intermarrying, or fighting, until one side submitted. It was messy, as most nation building is. But from this mess emerged a patchwork map of realms, each with its own customs and rulers bound together by language and culture, but divided by ambition. What's striking is how quickly the Saxons moved from outsiders to rulers. Within a century of their first major settlements, they weren't just raiders anymore. They were lawmakers, kings, administrators of justice. They had stopped being a problem on Rome's doorstep and started becoming the architects of a new order in Britain. It's as though, having once been mercenaries and squatters, they now looked around at their halls and fields and declared, "This is ours, and we will rule it." So as the smoke of raids cleared, and the generations turned, Britain in the 6th century no longer looked like the Britain of Rome, nor the Britain of Arthur's resistance. It was becoming Saxon Britain, a land of new kings, new laws, and new identities. And while these kingdoms would rise, clash, and sometimes fall, their foundations endured. The Saxons had crossed the sea not just to fight, but to stay. By the 6th century, Britain was no longer a tidy stage, with Romans strutting across stone roads and commanding from their villas. The actors had changed, the scenery had shifted. Saxon kingdoms were rising their timber halls and farmsteads spreading across valleys once dotted with Roman mosaics. But the island wasn't empty when the Saxons arrived. The Britons, the descendants of Romans, Celts, and everyone in between were still there, farming their fields, clinging to their languages, fortifying their hilltops. And as Saxon expansion pressed westward and northward, the two worlds collided. Yet the story isn't as simple as a bloody clash of civilizations. It's also a story of weaving conflict, yes, but also intermarriage adaptation and cultural fusion that reshaped the island in ways subtler than the chronicles admit. The Saxon Chronicle, that stern voice of later generations, makes it sound like the Saxons simply swept the Britons aside, sword in hand, field by field. Here we fought, here we won, here we built. But archaeology, with its patient whispers from the soil, paints a more nuanced picture. In Kent, Sussex, and the Thames Valley, we find Saxon and British artifacts side by side, Saxon brooches in one grave, Romano-British pottery in another, sometimes in the same cemetery. It suggests that life on the ground was often less about extermination and more about coexistence. Still, there was violence. Many Romano-British communities were pushed into the west, into Wales, Cornwall, and the Highlands. The names of rivers and hills tell us who stayed behind. The Thames, Severn, Avon. Those are Brittonic names, not Saxon. Even where Saxon settlements grew thickest, the land still whispered in Celtic syllables. Imagine a Saxon farmer guiding his plow through fields he thought were his muttering in Old English to his oxen, while the river beside him carried a name and a tongue older than either of them. Language was already weaving the two peoples together, thread by thread. Some Britons resisted fiercely. We already met Ambrosius Aurelianus and perhaps Arthur, who turned resistance into legend. But others made accommodations. In Essex, evidence suggests Saxon rulers allowed some Romano-British communities to continue more or less intact their traditions absorbed into Saxon frameworks. You can picture an old British elder, gray-haired, negotiating with a newly arrived Saxon chieftain. "Keep your warriors out of our fields, and we'll give tribute." Survival demanded flexibility. Intermarriage must have been common, though the chronicles stay politely silent on that. Archaeology gives us hints. Cemeteries with mixed grave goods, Saxon-style brooches lying next to Roman-influenced pottery children, buried with items from both traditions. Somewhere in those early centuries, a Romano-British woman sat at her loom, weaving cloth, while her Saxon husband returned from the fields. Their children grew up speaking Old English words at home, perhaps still hearing prayers muttered in Latin or Brythonic at their grandparents' hearth. Identities blurred, as they always do in times of migration. Religion, too, became a battleground of influence. The Saxons clung to their pagan gods, worshipping in groves and springs. The Britons, meanwhile, had inherited Christianity from Rome. For a time, the two faiths stood side by side, crosses raised over crumbling Roman churches in one village, offerings cast into rivers in another. And sometimes the lines blurred. A Saxon might whisper to Woden for victory in war, then ask a British priest for blessing on his fields. People hedge their bets when eternity is at stake. This coexistence left its mark on the landscape. Place names often fused Chester from the Latin castra, Fort Wick, from the Latin vicus settlement paired with Saxon terms. London became Lundenwic. Towns carried scars of Rome, layers of British continuity, and Saxon renaming. The result was a patchwork that reflected not a clean slate, but a palimpsest of cultures written over one another. And yet the narrative of conquest persisted because it suited both sides. For Saxon kings, boasting of victories, legitimized their rule. We conquered this land with fire and sword, therefore we deserve to reign. For Britons, who fled to the mountains and valleys of Wales, the story of violent loss preserved their identity. We were driven out, but we remain the true heirs of the land. Reality was murkier. Plenty of Britons stayed intermarried and became Saxon in all but ancestry. Life on the ground must have been filled with awkward negotiations and gradual adjustments. Imagine a village where Saxon newcomers settled near an older British community. At first suspicion, different languages, different gods, different customs. Then practical necessities forced cooperation. A shared well, a market where wool traded for grain, a marriage here, a boundary dispute there. After a generation, children born from both sides, speaking a language that blended words from each tongue. The boundary between Saxon and Briton slowly dissolving into daily life. It's tempting to see this process as grim inevitability, but it was also creative. Out of the weaving together of Briton and Saxon came the foundations of English identity. The language that emerged Old English was deeply Saxon at its core, but it carried traces of Celtic rhythm in place names and structure. Farming methods drew from both traditions. Even law codes written later reflected a mix of Germanic practice and Romano-British precedent. Conflict remained. The West was not easily tamed, and Britons in Wales and Cornwall retained fierce independence. Songs and poems in their native tongues told of tragic loss, heroic last stands, and the bitterness of exile. Yet even as they lamented, their culture seeped into the Saxon world, shaping its imagination. The Arthurian legend itself, though born of resistance, would later be cherished by the very descendants of the Saxons who had once been its enemies. So the story of Saxons and Britons in this period is not only of fire and sword, though those burned brightly enough. It is also the quieter story of weaving together, of shared wells and shared marriages, of names carried forward, of gods replaced but half remembered, of cultures colliding yet also combining. By the close of the 6th century, Britain was no longer Roman, nor fully Celtic, nor purely Saxon. It was becoming something new, something hybrid, something recognizably the seed of England. Picture a Saxon village in the late 6th century. The hall fire glows, warriors lounge with spears propped beside them, and in the background, an old priest of Woden sprinkles mead in a grove of oaks to honor the gods. For generations, this had been enough. The Saxons had their pantheon, Woden Thuner Frigg, and their worldview was clear. Life was short, weird was unshakable, and glory lived on in memory. Yet into this world of groves and firelight stepped new voices, pale-cloaked strangers carrying crosses, books, and songs in Latin. They came not with swords, but with a different kind of power, the promise of salvation and an eternal kingdom. The stage was set for one of the most fascinating encounters in European history, the meeting of Saxon paganism and Christianity. It did not happen overnight, nor did it unfold as a simple victory of one faith over the other. Instead, it was a long dance of persuasion, resistance, and compromise, where gods and saints often stood side by side, at least for a while. Kent once again took the lead. Around 597 A.D., a Roman missionary named Augustine landed on the island sent by Pope Gregory the Great, with instructions to bring the Saxons into the Christian fold. He came to Canterbury, where King Ethelbert ruled. Ethelbert's wife Bertha was already a Christian Frankish princess, and she had been quietly keeping the flame of her faith alive in her new Saxon home. Imagine her delight. Finally, reinforcements. Ethelbert himself was cautious. He allowed Augustine and his companions to preach, but insisted they do it outside, under the open sky. He didn't want their magic, as he called it, to get the better of him indoors. Wise man. But eventually, the king was baptized. With that single act, the Kentish kingdom began its pivot toward Christianity. It was a political calculation as much as a spiritual one. Embracing Christianity meant closer ties with powerful Frankish and Roman networks. It meant access to literate clergy who could write laws and record treaties. It meant continental recognition, a way for Ethelbert to dress his kingship in a cloak of divine legitimacy. For a Saxon ruler who wanted his authority to shine brighter than his rival's, Christianity was a potent ally. But conversion for the masses, that was another story. For ordinary Saxons, the old gods were woven into the fabric of life. They called on Thunor for storms, Woden for wisdom, Frigg for fertility. Abandoning them felt dangerous. What if the crops failed? What if the cattle sickened? So Christianity did what it often did in pagan lands. It adapted. Churches were built on sacred groves. Wells once dedicated to spirits became holy wells for saints. Festivals like Yule, filled with fire and feasting, were gently baptized into Christmas celebrations. Instead of tearing down the missionaries absorbed, the strategy was brilliant. Let people keep their rhythms, but give those rhythms new meaning. Of course, this didn't erase tension. Pagan priests bristled at the loss of authority. Some villagers undoubtedly muttered that the new god was foreign soft and too obsessed with turning the other cheek. A Saxon warrior, used to swearing loyalty to his lord and seeking glory in battle, may have scratched his head at sermons about humility. Humility. That's not how you impress Woden or anyone else. Yet Christianity had its appeal. It promised not just weird, an impersonal fate, but salvation, a personal afterlife of peace. It also offered stability in a fractured land. The bishop's staff became as powerful a symbol as the chieftain's spear. Literacy imported through the church allowed kings to codify law-controlled territory more effectively and even send letters to distant allies. Slowly, the advantages added up. But the story wasn't just Kent. Different kingdoms encountered Christianity in different ways. In the north, Celtic Christianity had already taken root through Irish missionaries, men like Saint Columba and later Saint Aidan. Their approach was austere monastic and deeply tied to scholarship. On the windswept island of Iona, or the holy ground of Lindisfarne monks in rough woolen habits, copied gospels by candlelight while waves crashed outside. Their artistry illuminated manuscripts, stone crosses carved with intricate knots, blended Celtic tradition with Christian devotion, creating beauty that still astonishes today. By the 7th century, these two traditions, Roman Christianity in the south and Celtic Christianity in the north, met and sometimes clashed. They even argued over the date of Easter, which may sound trivial, but in a deeply religious age, celebrating the resurrection on different days was no small matter. In 664, the Synod of Whitby settled at Northumbria. A rising Saxon kingdom chose Roman practice. In that moment, the Saxons aligned themselves with the wider European Christian world, and the Celtic strand, though never erased, stepped back from dominance. Yet even after official conversions, paganism lingered. Archaeologists find graves from this era that mix Christian symbols with pagan grave goods, crosses lying alongside spears, or women buried with Christian brooches and old amulets for protection. A Saxon villager might pray in church on Sunday, then leave a token in the river on Monday, just in case the old spirits were still watching. Conversion was not a clean break, but a gradual blending. Think of it as a conversation between gods and saints. Thunar's hammer gave way to St. Peter's keys. Woden's wisdom folded into stories of Christ's sacrifice, the fertility rituals of Frigg, reinterpreted as festivals for the Virgin Mary. To the Saxons, it may have felt less like betrayal and more like continuity under new names. The sacred fires still burned, only now in churches instead of groves. The result was transformation. Pagan Saxons became Christian Saxons, but they didn't lose themselves in the process. They carried forward their fierce independence, their sense of honor, their love of story and song. Christianity gave them new frameworks, law codes, monasteries, schools, but the Saxon soul still glowed beneath it all. When a monk in Northumbria painted a gospel with golden interlaced patterns, he was blending Christian truth with Saxon artistry. When a king enforced law with reference to both divine authority and ancient custom, he was fusing new faith with old weird. So as the 6th and 7th centuries passed, Britain's landscape changed. Timber halls stood beside stone churches. Monasteries rose where sacred groves once whispered, and the Saxons, once worshippers in shadowy forests, now knelt before stone altars, their voices raised in Latin prayers. But the old gods were not wholly forgotten. They lingered in stories, in place names in the very days of the week. Wednesday for Woden, Thursday for Thunar, Friday for Frigg. Even as the saints took the stage, the pagan caste remained in the wings, shaping the English world in ways both seen and unseen. By the 7th century, Britain was no longer a place of scattered warbands and temporary strongholds. The Saxons had dug in, multiplied, and organized themselves into kingdoms. Not one kingdom, not even two, but a whole patchwork quilt of competing realms, each with its own ambitions, traditions, and rivalries. Historians later called it the Heptarchy, the rule of 7, though in truth, the map was always more chaotic than the tidy number suggests. 7 was neat for the chroniclers. Reality was closer to a dozen jostling rulers at any given time. Still, the 7 names stuck: Kent, Sussex, Essex, Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. Picture it a map of Britain, covered not with Roman provinces, but with shifting kingdoms, like pieces on a chessboard that never quite stay still. Borders moved with every skirmish. Kings rose and fell. And somewhere in the middle of it, all ordinary villagers just tried to milk their cows, without worrying whether they now belonged to Mercia or East Anglia. Kent, as we saw earlier, had an early lead, thanks to its Frankish ties and Christian influence. Its kings issued law codes, built connections across the channel, and set the stage for diplomacy as a tool of power. Yet Kent's influence eventually waned, overshadowed by more aggressive neighbors. Sussex, the South Saxons, remained something of a backwater, hard to conquer, but rarely strong enough to conquer others. Its rulers often played second fiddle to more powerful kings, though they held fiercely to their independence when they could. Essex, too, had its moments, but struggled to keep pace, hemmed in by neighbors and lacking the sheer resources to dominate. Then there was East Anglia, rising from the flatlands of Norfolk and Suffolk. Its royal burials, especially the glittering treasures of Sutton Hoo, tell us just how rich and ambitious its kings could be. Imagine a ship burial stretching nearly 90 feet, laden with gold, silver Byzantine bowls, and an iconic helmet that looks like something straight out of an epic poem. Whoever lay in that ship, possibly King Redwald, was no petty chieftain. He was a ruler with international connections, a Saxon king thinking in global terms. East Anglia may not have dominated long, but for a moment it shone like a beacon of wealth and cultural blending. Further north, Northumbria rose as a giant. It began as two separate kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira, but by the 7th century they had fused into a formidable power stretching from the Humber to the Firth of Forth. Northumbrian kings, like Edwin Oswald and Oswiu, wielded power that made them contenders for overlordship of all Saxon England. Their courts became centers of both faith and politics. Monasteries like Lindisfarne and Jarrow thrived, producing art and scholarship that would echo for centuries. But Northumbria's power was fragile, constantly tested by rebellion rival kings and the dangers of overextension. Then came Mercia, rising in the Midlands, a landlocked power that made up for its lack of coastline with sheer force of personality. Mercian kings like Penda and Offa became legendary. Penda, still a pagan in a Christianizing world, carved his authority with sword and fire, resisting northern dominance. A century later, Offa built a literal wall, Offa's Dyke, stretching along the Welsh border to mark Mercian might. He even corresponded with Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor, as something like an equal. Mercia for a time looked like it might be the kingdom to unify them all. And finally, Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons. At first, it was small, one power among many. But its leaders, shrewd and adaptable, planted seeds of durability. Wessex kings were rarely the most flamboyant, but they were survivors. Where other kingdoms flared brightly and then burned out, Wessex endured, slowly gathering strength, until centuries later it would dominate the entire English story. The Heptarchy was not peaceful. Kings fought constantly, sometimes for land, sometimes for tribute, sometimes simply for prestige. The title of Bretwalda Britain ruler was occasionally claimed by the strongest king of the day, a kind of unofficial high kingship. It wasn't a permanent office, more like a bragging right. Look at me, I'm the Bretwalda, until someone stronger comes along. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lists a handful of these overlords, from Ethelbert of Kent to Offa of Mercia, each basking in temporary supremacy. But the moment you declared yourself Bretwalda, every other king started sharpening his spear. And through all this noise of rivalry, life went on. Farmers plowed, craftsmen worked, markets bustled. Ordinary Saxons probably cared less about which king sat on the throne, and more about whether they'd get a decent harvest. But to the rulers, every skirmish mattered, every alliance shifted the board. Sometimes they married to secure peace princesses, traded like precious pawns. Sometimes they baptized to gain prestige, converting not out of sudden piety, but because it made them look sophisticated in the eyes of continental powers. Still, there was glory in it too. The hall culture thrived, those smoky timber halls where warriors feasted, kings distributed treasure, and poets sang of victories. A good king was generous, fierce, and lucky in battle. A bad king was stingy, cowardly, or simply unlucky, and his reign tended to end with him lying face down in the mud. The Heptarchy was messy, vibrant, and endlessly unstable, but it laid the foundations for something bigger. Out of the chaos of 7 or more kingdoms, patterns of governance emerged. Law codes were written, churches built roads, and trade revived. A patchwork quilt, yes, but a quilt nonetheless, stitched together by rivalry, blood, and ambition. So picture the island in this era, banners fluttering above wooden halls, kings strutting with swords at their sides, monks quietly writing gospels in chilly cloisters, peasants sowing barley under skies that didn't care who was Bretwalda this week. It was not yet England, but it was on its way born of division, yet inching toward unity. Every so often, archaeology gifts us a moment of time travel. We peer into the earth and suddenly find ourselves face to face with a vanished world glittering in ways no chronicle ever described. For the Anglo-Saxons, that moment came at Sutton Hoo. It was 1939, on the eve of another world war, when archaeologists began digging beneath the grassy mounds of a Suffolk estate. What they uncovered stunned not only Britain, but the entire field of archaeology. The ghostly imprint of a ship, nearly 90 feet long, its timbers dissolved by the soil, but its shape preserved as if the earth had held a memory of its hull. And inside, a treasure trove that revealed the power and splendor of the early Saxon elite. Here was no crude barbarian grave. Here was a king's resting place, or at least a man who wanted to be remembered as one. Laid out were objects of astonishing craftsmanship, a helmet with a fearsome mask and delicate patterning of tinned bronze and garnet, a sword with gold fittings, shields adorned with shining bosses, drinking horns banded in precious metal, and silver bowls imported from as far away as Byzantium. Gold clasps glittered inlaid with garnets in interlaced designs so intricate that even today we squint at them in wonder. These were not the possessions of a rough warlord clinging to survival. These were symbols of international prestige, of wealth and artistry that reached far beyond the North Sea. Scholars still debate whose grave it was. Many believe it belonged to King Redwald of East Anglia, who died around 624. Redwald is remembered not only as a warrior, but as a political heavyweight, a man who played continental politics and balanced faiths. He famously kept altars to both Christ and the old gods in his hall, hedging his spiritual bets. If the Sutton Hoo ship was his, it tells us that he wanted to be remembered as a ruler of consequence, not just for East Anglia, but in the wider Saxon world. Sutton Hoo forces us to rethink the early Saxons. Too often, they are painted as mud-smeared farmers hacking each other with axes. But here, gleaming under Suffolk soil, was evidence of wealth trade and cosmopolitan connections. The garnets came likely from India or Sri Lanka, carried along the trade routes that linked the Mediterranean to the distant east. The silver bowls bore Byzantine designs. The artistry of the goldwork reveals workshops of dazzling skill. These were people plugged into a global network, not isolated tribes huddling in the dark. And Sutton Hoo is not alone. Across England, elite burials reveal the same story: warriors laid to rest with fine weapons, women adorned with elaborate jewelry, whole communities investing time and treasure to honor their leaders. The message is clear. The Saxon elite knew how to display power, and they wanted the gods, their people, and perhaps eternity itself to see it. The ship burial itself carries layers of meaning. To the Saxons, ships were more than transport. They were symbols of journey, fate, and transition. To be buried in a ship was to be sent on a voyage beyond death, equipped with the treasures needed in the next life. Imagine standing at that grave in the 7th century, watching warriors lower their lord's body into the vessel, priests muttering prayers, the air heavy with smoke and sorrow. Then the mound-raised earth piled high to seal both the ship and the memory. A statement to the living as much as a passage for the dead. Here lies power. Remember it. The artifacts of Sutton Hoo also reveal a fusion of cultures. The helmet design is distinctly Germanic in its mask and form, but its intricate decoration echoes Scandinavian and even Roman influences. The belt buckle, massive and golden, is worked with interlaced patterns that seem endless, symbolizing perhaps the unbroken nature of life and loyalty. The whole burial is a conversation between pagan ritual warrior pride and the growing whispers of Christianity. It is as if Redwald, or whoever lay there, wanted to hold all identities at once: warrior king, pagan, Christian Saxon, and participant in a wider world. What strikes us today is the sheer artistry. The gold buckle alone weighs over 400 grams and is engraved with patterns so fine that modern jewelers still marvel at the technique. The shoulder clasps are inlaid with garnet cloisonné, tiny cells filled with red gemstones arranged in intricate patterns. These are works of art on par with anything in Byzantium or Rome, but made in the workshops of Anglo-Saxon England. So much for the idea of a dark age. If this was darkness, it glittered. The Sutton Hoo treasures also tell us about the role of gift-giving in Saxon society. In the smoky halls of kings' warriors were rewarded with arm rings, brooches, and weapons. Treasure was not hoarded in vaults, but circulated, binding men together through loyalty and obligation. A king who gave generously was loved and remembered. A stingy king was abandoned. The burial goods at Sutton Hoo, then, were not just personal wealth. They were symbols of a life spent giving and receiving of bonds forged and remembered in gold. And beyond the elite graves, ordinary Saxon life was touched by this same cultural richness, if on a smaller scale. Pottery designs became more refined metalwork, more intricate textiles, more varied. The influence of trade brought new styles, new foods, new ways of thinking. Even in villages far from Sutton Hoo, a brooch copied in cheaper bronze or a bead of imported glass could make a woman feel connected to the glamour of distant courts. So when we speak of the splendor of the Saxons, we don't just mean the glitter of gold. We mean the whole tapestry, a society that could produce treasures of astonishing beauty, maintain networks of trade across seas, and weave art and faith into daily life. Sutton Hoo stands as a beacon in that tapestry, a reminder that even in an age of constant warfare, beauty and power walked hand in hand. Next time you see the famous helmet, its eyes glaring out from behind its mask-like face, remember that it was never meant to sit behind glass in a museum. It was meant to shine in the firelight of a hall, or to rest in darkness beneath a mound, whispering to the living, "This is who we were. This is what we valued. This is the splendor of our age." If Sutton Hoo revealed the worldly splendor of the Saxon elite, then the monasteries of Anglo-Saxon England revealed something more luminous still: the brilliance of the mind and the glow of faith. In the windswept north, on islands battered by sea spray, and in cloisters tucked into quiet valleys, monks worked wonders with quill and ink, turning the raw Saxon world into a place of learning artistry and spiritual power. This was the age when the Saxons, once feared as raiders, began to dazzle Europe with manuscripts and miracles. Let's set the scene. Imagine Lindisfarne, a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast. At low tide, you can walk to it across causeways, the sea shimmering on either side. At high tide, the waters rise and cut it off, leaving the monastery a lonely outpost between land and sea. Founded in 635 by the Irish monk Aidan Lindisfarne, became one of the most important Christian centers of the age. Its monks prayed, sang psalms, and most enduringly wrote. Their greatest achievement, the Lindisfarne Gospels, remains one of the most beautiful books in history. Turn its pages, and you see not mere writing, but an explosion of artistry. Cross-carpet pages, filled with interlaced designs, animals, and spirals woven into letters, colors so vivid they still shine today. To hold it, was to hold heaven in your hands. Nearby, at Jarrow and Wearmouth, another miracle unfolded. In the quiet hum of those cloisters lived Bede, a monk whose pen would preserve the very memory of the Saxons. His ecclesiastical history of the English people was not just a chronicle. It was the Saxons' passport into history, the reason we even have their story in coherent form. Bede wrote with humility, calling himself unworthy, yet his words shaped how the Saxons would be remembered forever. He gave us the tale of Augustine, the conversion of kings, and the long dance of pagan and Christian. Without him, much of what we recount would be scattered fragments. In a sense, every time we whisper Saxon history today, we whisper through Bede's quill. Monastic life was no luxurious retreat. It was disciplined rhythm and austerity. Picture monks, rising before dawn, shivering in the cold stone chapels, chanting psalms as the sea winds howled outside. Their days were measured by prayer work and study. They copied manuscripts not for fun, but as devotion, each letter a prayer, each page an offering. A monk bent over parchment might spend weeks on a single decorated page, his hand cramping, his eyes straining, while believing he was illuminating not just words, but the very word of God. And yet these places were not entirely cut off from the world. Kings patronized monasteries, sending gifts and land in exchange for prayers. Nobles sent their children to be educated there. Pilgrims visited to venerate relics, bones of saints, drops of blood, fragments of wood that were believed to carry divine power. Miracles were whispered. Blind men healed storms, calmed warriors saved in battle. Faith was not abstract. It was lived, seen, and in the eyes of believers proven. One of the most beloved figures of this time was Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, a shepherd turned monk, bishop, and saint. Tales of his holiness spread far and wide. He was said to commune with animals, pray for hours in icy waters, and perform miracles of healing. When he died, his body was found incorrupt, years later, a sign of sanctity. His relics became so venerated that monks carried them across England for centuries, finally enshrining them in Durham Cathedral. Cuthbert's story shows us how spirituality, miracle, and politics intertwined. The saint gave legitimacy to kings, and kings gave protection to saints. Meanwhile, monastic scriptoria, those workshops of words, were quietly transforming Europe's intellectual landscape. The monks of Northumbria corresponded with scholars in Ireland, Gaul, and even Rome. They sent books, received visitors, and exchanged ideas. A Saxon monastery was not an isolated island, but part of an international web of learning. And from this web came treasures like the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and later the Codex Amiatinus, a colossal Bible carried all the way to the Pope in Rome. The Saxons, once dismissed as illiterate pirates, had become book bearers to the world. It is easy to romanticize this world of candles and quills, but let's not forget the humor and humanity beneath the halos. Marginal notes and manuscripts show monks grumbling. "My hand is tired. It is very cold. This parchment is awful." They were saints, perhaps, but also humans, scribbling in bad lighting, wishing for better ink. Some even doodled tiny animals, peeking out from the margins, jokes frozen forever between holy texts. In those doodles, you glimpse the quiet chuckle of a monk centuries ago, reminding us that the past was never just solemn. The impact of these monasteries went far beyond pretty books. They preserved Latin learning, kept alive the memory of Rome, and nurtured the seeds of English identity. They trained administrators and educated kings' children. They provided sanctuaries in times of war. And when Viking sails later appeared on the horizon, they became symbols of what could be lost. So in the Saxon world, where kings feasted in smoky halls and warriors dreamed of glory, there was also this quieter glow, the light of manuscripts, the murmur of chants, the quiet scratch of quills on parchment. Monks bent over their work, believed they were saving souls. In truth, they also saved history. While the Saxons of Britain were busy building kingdoms, writing laws, and illuminating gospels, their cousins back on the continent were locked in a struggle that would define them for centuries. Across the Rhine, a new power was rising, the Franks led by none other than Charlemagne the towering king, who dreamed of uniting Christendom under his sword and cross. For the continental Saxons, stubborn forest-dwelling, fiercely independent, this was the ultimate nightmare. They had survived Romans' outlasted pressure from migrating tribes. But now, they faced a man whose determination was as relentless as their own. The continental Saxons were not quite the same as their Anglo-Saxon kin. Their homeland stretched across the thick forests and river valleys of what we now call Lower Saxony and Westphalia. They were organized not into centralized kingdoms, but into tribal districts, each with its own leaders and assemblies. Freedom was their pride. They gathered at the Thing, the assembly of free men, to decide laws and disputes. No king told them what to do. Power lay in consensus and the oaths of their warrior bands. For Charlemagne, who liked tidy hierarchies and obedient vassals, the Saxons were infuriating. They were like smoke tried to grab them, and they slipped away. And then there was their religion. The Saxons were among the last major pagan peoples of Europe. They worshipped in sacred groves, offered sacrifices at holy springs, and revered the Irminsul, a great pillar or tree believed to connect heaven and earth. It was their cosmic axis, the heart of their faith. To Charlemagne, a devout Christian and practical politician, this was intolerable. He could not allow stubborn pagans on his borders to resist both his armies and his God. And so began the Saxon Wars, a brutal decades-long conflict that drenched forests in blood. The wars started in 772, when Charlemagne marched into Saxon territory and made a statement that could not be misunderstood. He cut down the Irminsul. Imagine it warriors, watching in horror as their sacred pillar, the link between worlds, crashed to the ground under Frankish axes. It was both a military blow and a psychological assault. Charlemagne wasn't just after land, he was after their souls. The Saxons, however, were not about to submit. They struck back with ferocity, ambushing Frankish forces, burning churches, and retreating into forests where cavalry could not follow. Their leader, Widukind, emerged as the symbol of resistance. He was charismatic, clever, and relentless, appearing where least expected, striking hard and vanishing again. To the Saxons, Widukind was more than a chieftain, he was the embodiment of their defiance. To Charlemagne, he was a thorn that refused to be pulled. The wars dragged on year after year. Charlemagne would march in with overwhelming force, demanding baptism and loyalty. Some Saxons submitted only to rise again once the Franks withdrew. Whole communities were baptized by sword point, then quietly went back to their old gods as soon as the Frankish army disappeared over the horizon. Conversion for many was not faith, but survival. Then came the darkest moment. In 782, after a rebellion, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxons at Verdun. 4,500. Imagine the horror warriors bound, led out, and cut down en masse. The message was clear: resist, and you will die not as heroes, but as corpses piled in the mud. Even by the standards of the age, it was shocking. Some chroniclers tried to soften it, claiming perhaps the number was exaggerated or that the executions were necessary. But in Saxon memory, it was seared as a massacre proof of Frankish cruelty and the price of defiance. And yet the Saxons kept fighting. Widukind vanished into exile in Denmark, only to return again, stoking rebellion after rebellion. His name became legend, whispered in halls and forests. Finally, in 785, Widukind submitted. He accepted baptism at Charlemagne's court, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps out of pragmatism. Chroniclers described the scene: the fierce pagan, kneeling water poured over his head, the sign of the cross made. To the Franks, it was triumph the wild Saxon tamed. To the Saxons, it was more ambiguous. Did their hero betray them? Or did he live to fight another day, preserving his people by bending outwardly while their spirit remained unbroken? Over time, the war ground down the Saxons' resistance. Charlemagne built forts, installed garrisons, and flooded the land with missionaries. Slowly, painfully, the sacred groves were cut down, churches raised in their place. Pagan rituals were outlawed, sometimes punishable by death. Laws declared that eating meat in Lent or refusing baptism was a crime of capital weight. The Saxons, once free of kings and clerics, now found themselves entangled in the machinery of empire and church. And yet, even in defeat, they left their mark. Their stubbornness forced Charlemagne to commit decades of resources and manpower. Their traditions, though battered, lingered in folklore, in place names, in the deep memory of the land. Even their supposed submission was never total. Archaeologists find signs of continued pagan practice well into the 9th century, quiet offerings at springs, carved amulets tucked into graves. Beneath the veneer of Christianization, the old faith smoldered. What's striking about this clash is how different it was from the Saxon story in Britain. There, Saxons had been the invaders, carving kingdoms from Romano-British soil, gradually embracing Christianity on their own terms. Here, on the continent, they were the defenders, clinging to their ancestral ways against a foreign conqueror. In one land, they were builders of new orders. In the other, they were rebels against imperial might. Two faces of the same people, shaped by circumstance and fate. Charlemagne won, of course. By the time of his coronation as emperor in 800, the Saxons were officially Christian, their lands absorbed into the Carolingian world. But the cost was high, and the scars deep. The Saxons had been broken, but not erased. In their stubborn resistance, in the legend of Widukind, in the whispered memory of the Irminsul, they preserved a fierce identity that even conquest could not fully extinguish. So picture it, a Saxon warrior standing in the shadow of a freshly built church, where once his grove had stood. He crosses himself, as the Frankish priest taught him, but under his breath, he mutters an old prayer to Woden, just in case. His children will grow up Christian. His grandchildren will forget the old gods' names. But the fire of defiance, the knowledge that their ancestors fought, resisted and bled, rather than bow easily, that will linger an ember glowing under the ashes of empire. It was the summer of 793 when the storm broke. The Saxons of Britain had grown used to rivalry among themselves, Mercia fighting Northumbria, Kent squabbling with Sussex, the usual neighborly chaos. They had also grown accustomed to a quieter kind of rhythm, monks chanting in cloisters, kings negotiating with bishops, trade flowing across the North Sea. And then suddenly, the sea itself seemed to spit out demons. On the windswept coast of Lindisfarne, the holy island where St. Cuthbert had been revered, longships appeared. Sleek, terrifying, and utterly new. The raiders who spilled onto the shore were not Saxons, not Britons, not Franks. They were Vikings, and their arrival shattered the fragile calm of Saxon England. The chronicles recorded in tones of horror. The pagans desecrated God's house with plunder and slaughter. Monks fled, treasures were stripped, and holy relics scattered. For Saxons who had once been raiders themselves, it must have felt like looking into a mirror. Only this reflection carried axes, sharper ships, faster, and a hunger that would not be sated easily. At first, the Viking raids were like flashes of lightning, sudden, brief, and devastating. A monastery here, a market town there. They came in summer, when the seas were calmer, struck hard, and vanished before Saxon armies could gather. But by the mid-9th century, the lightning became a storm. Instead of small raiding parties, the great heathen army landed in 865, a coalition of Norse warlords determined not just to plunder, but to conquer. Northumbria was the first to crumble. Once a mighty kingdom with saints and scholars, it was torn apart as Viking forces captured York in 866. Mercia wavered signing treaties and paying tribute in desperate attempts to survive. East Anglia fell into chaos, its king reportedly killed by a grisly martyrdom at Viking hands. Only Wessex, the seemingly modest kingdom of the West Saxons, remained as the stubborn bulwark. For the Saxons, the Viking threat was terrifying because it felt familiar. The Norse shared their language roots, their love of mead and hall culture, their worship of gods who prized war and fate. But the Vikings were sharper in their execution. Their long ships could sail up rivers, appearing far inland without warning. Their armies moved quickly, their tactics flexible. And their ruthlessness left scars. Villages burned, populations, enslaved churches desecrated. What did a Saxon peasant see when the longships appeared on the horizon? Perhaps he had just finished a day's plowing when the shouts echoed from the riverbank. He grabbed his family, fled to the woods, and watched helplessly as smoke curled into the sky. The terror was not only the violence, but the unpredictability. No wall, no field, no prayer felt entirely safe. Yet the Saxons did not fold. They fought shield to shield, spear to spear. Chronicles describe desperate battles where Saxon armies tried to block river crossings or hold fortified burhs. Villages began fortifying themselves with ditches and palisades. The Saxons had learned from their own past. As raiders, mobility mattered, and defenses had to be flexible. Slowly, they adapted to match Viking ferocity. Still, the costs were enormous. Danegeld tribute payments to Viking leaders became an ugly necessity. Kings would gather silver handed over and pray the raiders kept their word. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. It was a cycle of bribery, betrayal, and exhaustion. Imagine the bitterness of a Saxon king raising taxes on his people to pay off pagans, knowing full well they might return the following year. And yet amid the devastation, something extraordinary was happening. The Viking threat forced the Saxons to think in new terms, less as divided kingdoms, and more as a united people. The constant menace of dragon-proud ships pushed them toward cooperation, stronger defenses, and leaders capable of commanding loyalty across tribal lines. In a strange twist, the Vikings who sought to unravel Saxon England ended up forging its identity. The battles of this era were brutal, but they forged legends. The Chronicle speaks of bloody clashes at Reading Ashdown and Eddington. Shield walls clashed with a thunderous sound, spears rattled, axes hacked, and kings fought shoulder to shoulder with their men. For warriors, it was weird, at its fiercest, the fates of kingdoms turning on the strength of a shield arm. And yet not all was hatred. Over time, Vikings settled as well as raided. The Danelaw, the swath of England under Norse control, became a patchwork of mingled cultures. Place names ending in by and Thorpe marked Norse villages. Laws, customs, and even farming techniques blended. Some Saxon women married Viking settlers. Some Saxon children grew up learning Norse words alongside Old English. Just as earlier, Saxons had mingled with Britons. Now Saxons mingled with Norsemen, creating yet another layer of English identity. But in the 9th century, when the storm was still raging, the Saxons must have felt they stood on the brink of annihilation. The Danes were everywhere, the north and east overrun Mercia, wavering monasteries in flames. Only the stubbornness of Wessex kept a fragile hope alive. It was here in the marshes and hills of the southwest that the Saxons made their stand. So as the smoke of Viking raids rose into the sky, the Saxons faced their greatest test. Would they be broken as Northumbria and East Anglia had been? Or would they rally, adapt, and find a leader who could match fire with fire, shield with shield? The answer, as we'll see, lay in the unlikely figure of a king who would one day be called the Great. The story of Alfred is one of those rare moments in history where a single figure seems to step out of the mist and embody the survival of a people. When we think of Alfred the Great, we imagine the wise king, the lawgiver, the scholar, the builder of fortresses. But to truly feel the weight of his greatness, we need to remember where he started in desperation, clinging to scraps of land in the swamps with Viking warbands prowling all around him. Alfred was born in 849, the youngest son of the royal family of Wessex. In his youth, he traveled to Rome and met the Pope, a sign of the growing ties between Saxon kings and the wider Christian world. But his destiny was not to be a cloistered pilgrim. By the time he inherited the throne in 871, Wessex was the last Saxon kingdom still standing free. Northumbria had fallen. East Anglia was overrun. Mercia had been carved up, its kings reduced to pawns. The great heathen army had smashed its way through England, and Alfred inherited not a crown of peace, but a battlefield. His early reign was brutal. In 878, disaster struck at Chippenham when a surprise Viking attack forced Alfred to flee with only a small band of followers. Imagine the king of the Saxons, once lord of halls and warriors, now hiding in the marshes of Somerset, living among reeds and mud reduced almost to the life of a fugitive. The stories from this time are haunting Alfred disguised, wandering from hut to hut, depending on the charity of peasants. One tale, half legend, half truth, tells of him being scolded by a peasant woman for burning her cakes while lost in thought about his kingdom. It's oddly humanizing, this mighty king, distracted and brooding, letting flatbread scorch on the fire. Yet the marshes became his crucible. From these swamps, Alfred began to rebuild. He gathered loyal warriors, rallied hidden bands of Saxons, and reminded them that Wessex was not finished. The image of the king in the marshes became a symbol of resilience. If the king could endure, so too could his people. And then with carefully planned strikes, Alfred emerged from hiding. The climax came at the Battle of Edington in 878. Here, Alfred faced Guthrum the Viking leader in a clash that would decide England's future. Picture the scene shield walls, locking spears, thrusting the clash of iron echoing across the fields. The Saxons fought with desperate determination, knowing there was nowhere left to fall back to. And against the odds, Alfred triumphed. Guthrum was forced to submit, and remarkably was baptized as part of the peace settlement. It was not just a military victory, but a symbolic one pagan warlord turned Christian godson standing as proof of Alfred's authority. But Alfred knew one victory was not enough. He set about transforming Wessex into a kingdom that could withstand future storms. His genius lay not only in courage, but in structure. He reorganized the Fyrd, the Saxon militia, so that part of the force was always ready to fight, while the rest tended their fields. He built a network of burhs, fortified towns placed strategically across Wessex, each a refuge for villagers and a base for counterattacks. If a Viking warband struck, it found itself facing not undefended farms, but stout walls and organized resistance. These burhs became the skeleton of future English towns, many still standing on Alfred's foundations today. Alfred even turned to the sea. Recognizing that Viking ships gave them the edge, he commissioned new vessels, larger and swifter, designed to chase raiders along the coast. It was a Saxon navy in embryo, and though not always successful, it marked a turning point. The Saxons would not be content to defend, they would strike back. Yet Alfred was more than a warrior. He was a thinker. He believed a strong kingdom needed more than swords. It needed wisdom, law, and faith. He commissioned translations of key texts into Old English so that even those who did not know Latin could learn. He translated himself, working on Gregory's pastoral care, convinced that rulers must be shepherds of their people, not just warlords. He reissued law codes blending Mosaic principles, Christian teachings, and old Saxon customs into a framework of justice. His vision was not merely survival, but renewal a kingdom with soul as well as shield. The contrast is striking. While Viking leaders carved out short-lived domains through fire and plunder, Alfred built institutions that endured. His dream was not only to resist the Danes, but to forge a sense of unity among the Saxons, to make them feel like one people rather than scattered tribes. He never ruled all of England, but he laid the foundations for the kingdom that would. And through it all, there is that image of Alfred in the marshes. It lingers because it captures the essence of leadership, not the crown on the throne, but the man in exile, refusing to give up. A king who could be scolded over burned bread and still rise to shape a nation. A leader who carried his people from mud to majesty. By the time Alfred died in 899, he was more than a king. He was a legend. His children and grandchildren would build on his work, pushing the Danes back, uniting the Saxons, and creating the Kingdom of England. But without Alfred's grit in the swamps, his vision in the halls, and his faith in the future, there may never have been an England at all. So from the reeds of Somerset to the fortresses of Wessex, Alfred earned his title not just king, but the Great. When Alfred the Great died in 899, Wessex was battered, but unbroken, scarred by war, yet girded with the fortress's laws and vision he had left behind. His death could easily have marked the end of Saxon resistance. After all, one charismatic leader often carries a cause on his back, only for it to stumble once he's gone. But Alfred's heirs refused to stumble. They took the torch he had lit in the marshes and carried it further, burning brighter than even he might have imagined. His son Edward, known to posterity as Edward the Elder, stepped into his father's shoes. It was not an enviable position. The Danes were still strong, controlling vast swaths of northern and eastern England, the so-called Danelaw. Mercia, once a proud kingdom in its own right, was now half subjugated and divided. And Wessex, though resilient, could not stand alone forever. Edward needed more than courage. He needed allies, and he had one in an unexpected quarter, his sister, Ethelfled. Ethelfled was no ordinary princess. She had grown up in Alfred's world of sieges, burrs, and desperate resistance, and she had absorbed both his grit and his vision. Married to Ethelred, Lord of Mercia, she became deeply entwined in the politics of the Midlands. But when her husband fell ill, she stepped forward not as a regent, not as a consort, but as ruler in her own right. History remembers her as the Lady of the Mercians, one of the very few women in early medieval Europe to command armies and govern a kingdom. Together, Edward in Wessex and Ethelfled in Mercia coordinated a campaign of reconquest that gradually rolled back the Danelaw. It wasn't the kind of glorious single battle that chroniclers love to sing about. It was a slow grind, a chess game of fortresses, alliances, and relentless pressure. The burr system that Alfred had built became their greatest weapon. Edward and Ethelfled extended and expanded it, dotting the landscape with fortified towns. Each new burr was a thorn in the Vikings' side, a place they could not easily raid, a base from which Saxon forces could strike out. The strategy worked like a ratchet. Once territory was secured and a burr planted, it rarely slipped back into enemy hands. Town by town, shire by shire, they clawed back England. For peasants living under constant threat of Viking raids, the sight of new ramparts rising must have felt like a lifeline. Behind those ditches and timber palisades, life could breathe again. Markets reopened, fields were plowed without constant dread, and churches rebuilt. Ethelfled, in particular, became legendary. Chroniclers describe her leading armies into battle rallying Mercians with her presence. In 917, she captured the Viking stronghold of Derby, a daring move that showed her strategic brilliance. Later that same year, she took Leicester, and even the city of York invited her to become their ruler before her death cut that plan short. For a Saxon woman to inspire such loyalty in both Saxons and Norse was extraordinary. She proved that leadership was not bound to gender, but to vision and courage. Edward, for his part, consolidated his power in the south and pushed steadily north. His campaigns against Viking-held East Anglia and Essex wore down Norse resistance. Step by step, he tightened the Saxon grip on England. By the time of his death in 924, Wessex and Mercia together dominated the island, and the dream of uniting all Saxons under one crown was closer than ever. It was their combined efforts that prepared the way for Aethelstan, Edward's son, who would become the first king to rule a truly united England. But that triumph belonged to the next generation. For Edward and Ethelfled, their legacy was in the groundwork, the reconquest, the fortresses, the revival of Saxon authority. Imagine the scene in the early 10th century. Viking warbands still prowl the rivers, but their grip is loosening. Saxon banners rise over newly fortified towns. Markets bustle with trade once more, guarded by stout walls. In smoky halls, poets sing of Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, who dared to lead armies, and of Edward the Elder, who turned Alfred's survival into something stronger, a Saxon resurgence. There's a quiet irony here, too. The Saxons who once had come to Britain as invaders themselves had now become the defenders of its soil, the guardians of its identity. They fought not only for land, but for an idea that England, fractured though it was, could become whole. And slowly, with spear and spade fortress and treaty, they made it so. Part 18. A Kingdom Called England. By the early 10th century, the dream that had once seemed impossible in England united under one crown was inching closer to reality. Alfred had defended. Edward and Ethelfled had reconquered. Now it was time for the next generation to bind the patchwork of Saxon and Viking lands into something new, a kingdom not just of Wessex or Mercia, but of England. That honor fell to Aethelstan, son of Edward the Elder and grandson of Alfred the Great. When he came to the throne in 924, he inherited both a strengthened Wessex and a Mercia that had been carefully knit into alliance by his father and his remarkable aunt, Ethelfled. Aethelstan was young, but he had been raised amid war strategy and politics. More importantly, he carried a vision larger than survival. Where Alfred had fought to save Wessex and Edward had fought to dominate southern England, Aethelstan dreamed of ruling the entire island. It didn't take long for him to prove his mettle. In 927, he conquered York, the Viking stronghold of Northumbria, bringing the last of the great Saxon kingdoms under his rule. That moment is often marked by historians as the true birth of England. For the first time, the lands south of the River Tweed were united under one king. Imagine the weight of that villages that had once sworn to rival Saxon kings or to Viking jarls, now bowing to a single overlord. For people accustomed to chaos and shifting allegiances, it must have felt both strange and momentous. Aethelstan knew how to make his authority stick. He didn't just fight, he organized. He expanded the network of Shire's administrative districts that divided land neatly for taxation justice and military service. Each shire was broken down into hundreds local units that kept track of obligations and ensured no community slipped too far outside the king's grasp. This system gave England a backbone, a structure that would endure for centuries long after Ethelstan's name faded from popular memory. Coinage, too, became a mark of unity. Silver pennies stamped with the king's image circulated widely, reminding every hand that held one whose face truly mattered. For a farmer in East Anglia or a merchant in Winchester, these coins were more than currency. They were daily tokens of belonging to a larger whole. In an age when literacy was rare, a coin was a message in metal. You are part of England, and this is your king. But Aethelstan was not content with mere administration. He cultivated an image of majesty that reached beyond the island. His court drew scholars from abroad, men who carried with them the learning of the continent. He corresponded with kings and emperors, arranged marriages with European dynasties, and positioned himself not as a local ruler, but as a monarch of European stature. To visiting envoys, the halls of Aethelstan must have seemed impressive indeed. Lavish feasts, glittering gifts, and laws proclaimed in both Latin and Old English. Still, unity was never without its challengers. The Vikings had not vanished. They lingered in the north and across the sea in Dublin, watching for weakness. Welsh princes eyed the growing Saxon power with suspicion, while Scots kings tested their northern borders. It all came to a head in 937 at the Battle of Brunanburh. There, Aethelstan faced a coalition of Scots-Norse and Irish kings determined to check his ambition. The clash was enormous, one of the bloodiest battles in early English history. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it with rare poetic fervor, calling it a great slaughter, where swords clashed, shields shattered, and men fell. But Aethelstan won. Brunanburh secured his reputation as not just a ruler of England, but a defender of it. Later generations remembered the battle as a kind of birth cry of the English nation. It was proof that England could stand united against its foes. For the first time, the idea of an English identity bound by common kingship language and law felt more real than myth. Daily life, too, reflected this shift. With unity came stability. Farmers knew that burghs and shires offered protection and order. Markets flourished, silver flowed, and monasteries rebuilt after Viking attacks found new patrons in kings who saw themselves as guardians of both faith and learning. Law codes under Aethelstan spoke not only of theft and blood feuds, but of the king's role as shepherd of justice. The people were not merely subjects. They were participants in a kingdom that aspired to something larger. And yet, for all his achievements, Aethelstan's fame dimmed quickly after his death in 939. Later chroniclers gave more attention to Alfred, the romantic figure in the marshes, or to later kings who clashed with Normans. But if we are honest, Aethelstan deserves the title of Architect of England. He took the fragile inheritance of Alfred and Edward and built it into a coherent realm, recognized abroad, defended at home, and remembered in poetry. Picture the end of his reign, an aging king in his hall, silver pennies spilling from chests, charters sealed with his name, warriors feasting at tables, monks chanting prayers, and monasteries rebuilt under his patronage. Outside, the land stretches from Cornwall to Northumbria, united under one crown. England, an idea once fragile, once laughable, is now real. For all the glitter of kings and the clash of armies, the heartbeat of Saxon England lay in the quieter rhythms of daily life, plowing, weaving, bargaining, praying, and when things went wrong, arguing about compensation at the village assembly. This was a society that, despite its wars, was remarkably good at organizing itself. From kings' law codes down to the hum of the marketplace, the Saxons stitched order into a world that might otherwise have fallen apart. Law was central. From the earliest Kentish kings, like Ethelbert, to Alfred and Ethelstan, kings issued codes that set the rules of the land. These were not abstract proclamations to gather dust. They were practical, concerned with everything from murder to stolen cattle. Justice in the Saxon world was less about punishing crime for the state's sake and more about restoring balance. If you killed someone, the solution was not execution, but Wergild man price. Every life had a set value depending on rank. A nobleman's death demanded a higher fine than a freeman's, and a slave's life cruelly was valued at less. Pay the Wergild, and peace could be restored. Refuse and feuds erupted. It might sound cold, but there's a strange kind of logic to it. Instead of endless cycles of revenge, the law tried to give people a way out, a means of turning bloodshed into silver, of keeping communities intact. Imagine two families glaring at each other across a smoky hall. Grief and anger, thick in the air, while a reeve solemnly counts out coins to settle the matter. Not justice, as we define it, you might think, but perhaps just enough to stop more corpses piling up. Communities were deeply bound by oath and obligation. The tithing groups of 10 households shared responsibility for keeping order. If one man broke the law, his neighbors were expected to drag him to justice. This collective responsibility might sound oppressive, but it built cohesion. Your reputation mattered enormously. To be an oath breaker was to be an outcast, stripped of trust. Honor wasn't just a poetic ideal, it was a daily currency more valuable than silver. Society itself was layered, but not as rigid as in later feudal times. At the top were kings and nobles, their wealth measured in land treasure and the loyalty of warriors. Below them were freemen farmers who owned or rented land, who attended the thing and owed military service in the fyrd. Lower still were the seorls, the backbone of Saxon farming life, working small plots with plows drawn by oxen, living in timber houses that smelled of smoke straw and animals. And beneath them were slaves, captives from raids, debtors who had lost their freedom, or the unlucky poor. Slavery was a grim reality of Saxon society, woven into households and estates, a reminder that freedom was both precious and fragile. Daily life revolved around the seasons. In spring, fields were plowed and sown with barley, oats, and wheat. Summer brought weeding, herding, and the first cut of hay. Autumn was harvest, the anxious culmination of months of labor, while winter was a time of slaughtering livestock, preserving food, and huddling by the hearth. Every task was communal. Men and women worked side by side, children learning by watching elders guiding with memory and story. There were no machines, only hands, animals, and the rhythms of weather. The villages themselves were clusters of timber houses around a central hall. Roofs were thatched floors, often beaten earth smoke escaping through small holes in the roof. The hall of a lord was larger, hung with shields, and decorated with carved wood. But even the humblest hut had its loom, its hearth, its tools. Archaeology shows us simple pots for cooking, combs carved from bone, and iron knives worn down from use. These were lives lived close to the ground every day, a negotiation with nature. Yet it wasn't all drudgery. Feast days punctuated the year, harvest celebrations, Yule in midwinter, spring, festivals now draped in Christian names, but still carrying older echoes. These were moments of release, when ale flowed, songs rose, and the hall echoed with laughter. Imagine a weary plowman, calloused hands clutching a horn of mead, swaying to the rhythm of a bard's tale of Beowulf or Arthur. For a night at least, the cares of cattle and crops faded in the firelight. Religion was woven into the fabric of daily life too. By this time, Christianity had spread across the kingdoms, but old pagan habits lingered. A Saxon might bow at Mass in the morning and mutter a charm against elf shot in the evening if his cow fell ill. Monks prayed in stone churches, but ordinary villagers often treated saints' relics, much as they had treated sacred groves, sources of mysterious immediate power. Faith was not abstract. It was practical, protective, and always close at hand. Markets buzzed in larger towns and burrs. Traders sold saltcloth pottery and iron tools. Foreign goods, wine spices, glass beads filtered in from across the channel, showing that even a Saxon farmer in the Danelaw was part of a larger world. Coins jingled stamped with the king's face, though barter was still common. For many, the market was more than commerce. It was gossip courtship and spectacle a day when the village stretched its limbs and remembered it was part of something bigger. Education, at least for the elite, became increasingly valued. Alfred and his heirs had championed learning, and monasteries taught Latin scripture and sometimes Old English literacy. But most ordinary Saxons learned not from books, but from experience how to thatch a roof mend, a plow, weave, a cloth sing a riddle. The oral tradition thrived. Old English riddles still amuse us today, describing everyday objects in playful, poetic disguise, a bookworm that eats words, a mead hall lamp that is both bright and brittle. These riddles were more than games. They reflected a culture that delighted in cleverness and saw poetry in plows and mead cups. Life was not easy, but it had structure, community, and a fierce sense of belonging. The Saxons valued loyalty, law, and memory. They sang of heroes in smoky halls, yes, but they also lived by rules hammered out in village gatherings, by obligations to kin and lord, by the daily grind of soil and seasons. It was a world where honor could be weighed in silver, but also where laughter rose in the mead hall, and a simple charm against misfortune might sit beside the Lord's Prayer on a villager's lips. This was the England Alfred's descendants were building, not just a kingdom of crowns and coins, but a society of plows, oaths, markets, and laws. And though kings would rise and fall, it was this web of daily life, the sea-orl in his field, the reeve in the marketplace, the monk at his desk, that gave England its enduring strength. If the Saxons left us fortresses and coins, laws and chronicles, they also left us something more fragile yet more powerful, their imagination. Words spoken in smoky halls, songs carried on the lips of bards, riddles whispered over mead cups. In this tapestry of oral tradition, we catch a glimpse of how the Saxons dreamed, feared, and made sense of their world. And at the center of it all, towering like a hero in a hall, stands one poem, Beowulf. Beowulf is the crown jewel of Anglo-Saxon literature, a story sung long before it was written down in the 8th or 9th century. It tells of a Geatish hero cousin to the Saxons who sails across the sea to aid the Danish king Hrothgar. There in the mead hall, Heorot Beowulf battles the monster Grendel, then Grendel's avenging mother, and finally, in his old age, a dragon whose fiery breath costs him his life. On the surface, it is a tale of monsters and courage, but listen closely, and you hear the Saxon worldview echoing in every line: the fragility of life, the inevitability of fate, the hunger for honor, the grief of mortality. Imagine a Saxon hall at night. Warriors sit shoulder to shoulder, their shields hung on the walls behind them, the fire crackling the air thick with the smell of roasted meat. A scop, the bard rises harp in hand and begins to chant. His voice is steady, rhythmic, carrying the tale of Beowulf's deeds. The warriors listen, some nodding, some grinning at memories of their own battles, all bound together by the story. This was entertainment, yes, but also instruction. The poem reminded them what it meant to be a man of worth, to face wired with courage, to give treasure generously, to earn a song that would outlive the body. What makes Beowulf remarkable is how it straddles two worlds, the pagan and the Christian. It sings of fate and glory, of oaths and vengeance, yet it also contains Christian reflections, references to God's will, echoes of biblical imagery. It is the very embodiment of the Saxon soul during transition, torn between the groves of the old gods and the sermons of the new faith. Beowulf may fight monsters, but the true battle of the poem is with time, with death, with the inevitability that even the greatest hall will fall silent one day. The Saxons loved more than epics. Their imagination delighted in riddles, many preserved in the Exeter Book. These riddles are playful, earthy, and sometimes slyly humorous. They describe everyday objects: an onion, a bookworm, a plow, with riddling metaphors that turn the mundane into the mysterious. I am a wondrous creature, a joy to women, useful to neighbors. My stem is erect. I am tall, in a bed, I stand up straight. Yes, that's an Anglo-Saxon riddle about an onion, though the double entendre was not lost on them either. These riddles remind us that Saxons laughed as much as they fought, that cleverness was as prized as strength. Poetry was not a pastime, but a way of seeing the world. The elegies poems like The Wanderer and The Seafarer sing of exile, loneliness, and longing. In them, we hear the voices of men who had lost their lords, their comrades, their halls. They wander the cold sea, mourn the collapse of Mead Hall Fellowship, and ponder the fleeting nature of life. There's a haunting beauty in these verses, the sense that everything solid gold glory friendship is fragile, swept away by time's relentless tide. And yet, even in sorrow, the poems cling to meaning, to the hope that faith or memory can outlast decay. This poetic world was not confined to elite halls. Ordinary Saxons too absorbed it. A farm wife, humming a riddle, while weaving a shepherd, chanting a half-remembered verse under the stars, a village boy, listening wide-eyed to tales of heroes long gone. In a largely illiterate world, poetry was how culture lived, memorized, repeated, reshaped, with every telling. Words were currency almost as powerful as silver. A king who gave treasure was praised in song. A coward who failed in battle was mocked in verse. Reputation was not written in contracts, but sung into memory. And then there was music, the harp, the lyre, the chant. We cannot hear it now, but fragments of instruments unearthed in graves suggest melodies that carried these verses, turning words into living sound. Imagine the resonance of a harp string in a timber hall, the vibration matching the rhythm of warriors' hearts as Beowulf's fight unfolded. Poetry was not something to read silently. It was performance drama, an act of communal imagination. Through their literature, the Saxons reveal themselves not only as fighters and farmers, but as thinkers and dreamers. Their monsters reflect their fears. Outsiders chaos the wilderness beyond the firelight. Their heroes embody their ideals: loyalty, generosity, courage. Their riddles reveal their humor, their elegies, their melancholy. Together, these works sketch the Saxon imagination, a world both brutal and beautiful, where death was close, but memory eternal, where words bound people as tightly as oaths. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The Scop's voice, rising in a hall, warriors pounding the table in approval, the flicker of torchlight illuminating faces wrapped with story. Or the solitary murmur of a wanderer on a cold shore, whispering a verse to himself against the wind. In these words, the Saxons lived twice, once in their bodies and once in their poetry. And that second life astonishingly still endures. By the 10th century, the Saxons had achieved something remarkable, a kingdom that could truly be called England. United under Ethelstan and strengthened by his successors, the Saxon state was more than a patchwork of warlords. It was a realm of shires, burrs, coins, and kings who saw themselves as heirs of Alfred and guardians of Christendom. Yet history has a way of testing its champions, and for the Saxons, the 10th and 11th centuries were a long, dramatic seesaw decline revival, and the slow march toward one final fateful reckoning. After Ethelstan's death, his successors kept the kingdom intact, but the Vikings were never far away. In the later 10th century, raids resumed with a vengeance. Viking fleets, some now based in Denmark, launched fresh waves against England's coasts. Monasteries were looted, towns torched, and the hard-won sense of security unraveled. Kings like Edgar the Peaceful tried to project authority. Edgar famously took a grand symbolic voyage on the River Dee, rowed by 8 sub-kings to show his overlordship, but such theater could not stop longships from slicing through the seas. The real crisis came under Ethelred, whom history has cruelly labeled the Unready. The nickname comes from the Old English unread, meaning bad counsel, not lazy incompetence, as we often imagine. But the reputation stuck, and not without reason. Ethelred struggled to face the new Viking onslaught, paying vast sums of Danegeld tribute money to buy temporary peace. Silver flowed out of England in rivers enriching Viking leaders and encouraging them to come back for more. Imagine the frustration of a Saxon farmer taxed heavily to pay off pagans, only to see the same fleet return the following summer. It must have felt like throwing coins into the sea. The Viking pressure grew unbearable, and in 1013, King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark actually conquered England outright, forcing Ethelred into exile in Normandy. For a moment, it seemed the Saxon line had snapped. Svein died shortly after, but his son, Knut, or Canute, as he's often remembered, secured the throne in 1016, after defeating Edmund Ironside, Ethelred's son, in a bloody contest. England now had a Danish king. Knut, however, was not merely a conqueror. He proved to be a shrewd ruler, blending Viking and Saxon traditions. He married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, to legitimize his claim, and he worked hard to present himself not as an alien overlord, but as a Christian king of England. He patronized the church-issued law codes and maintained the structures Alfred and Ethelstan had built. For nearly 2 decades, England prospered under Knut's rule, part of a North Sea empire that stretched across Denmark and Norway. In some ways, it was a golden moment, but one balanced precariously on foreign dynastic politics. When Knut died in 1035, the fragile balance collapsed. His sons squabbled, the dynasty faltered, and the Saxon line, long thought extinguished, surged back. Edward, son of Ethelred and Emma, returned from exile in Normandy to be crowned in 1042. Known as Edward the Confessor, he was pious, austere, and more at home in cloisters than on battlefields. Under his reign, the influence of Norman advisors at court grew, a sign of the deepening ties across the Channel. Edward's greatest legacy would not be military, but spiritual. He founded Westminster Abbey, a church that still anchors England's monarchy today. Yet Edward's reign left one disastrous problem: unresolved succession. He died childless in 1066, leaving a scramble for the throne. The Saxon nobility chose Harold Godwinson, a powerful earl and skilled leader, as king. Harold was brave, capable, and in another timeline might have gone down as one of England's greatest rulers. But fate, or weird, had one last twist. That same year, 2 invasions descended. First, Harald Hardrada of Norway, a fierce Viking king, landed in the north with a massive force. Harold Godwinson marched with astonishing speed, defeating Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, in a clash so ferocious that later tales claimed the river ran red with blood. It was a dazzling victory, the kind that might have secured Harold's reputation forever. But no sooner had he triumphed than news came: William, Duke of Normandy, had landed on the southern coast. Exhausted but resolute, Harold rushed south to meet him. At Hastings, in October 1066, the Saxons stood shield to shield, holding firm for most of the day. Harold himself fought in the thick of it, rallying his men. but Norman cavalry and archers eventually broke the Saxon lines. By evening, Harold lay dead-struck, legend says, by an arrow to the eye, and the Saxon shield wall was shattered. With that, the age of the Saxons ended. After 6 centuries of migration, raiding kingship, and nation-building, their line was cut short by Norman conquest. England did not vanish, of course. It transformed, absorbing Norman feudalism, law, and language. But the Saxon dynasty, the world of Alfred Ethelflaed and Ethelstan, was gone. And yet the Saxons did not vanish entirely. Their language, Old English, mingled with Norman French to become Middle English, the ancestor of the words you and I speak now. Their laws, their shire system, their sense of communal obligation endured beneath Norman rule. Their poetry, their saints, their stories lingered. Even their kings, though defeated, became legends. Alfred the Great, still revered, Harold Godwinson, still remembered as the last Saxon king who fought valiantly to the end. So the story of the Saxons closes not with a whimper, but with a clash of arms on a Sussex hillside. From marshland wanderers to kings of England, they had traveled far. They built a kingdom from crisis-weathered storms of Vikings, and for a moment united an island. Their fall was tragic, but their legacy lives in every word of English, in every church spire, in every place, name ending in ton or ham. The Saxons may have lost their crown, but they gave us a language, a law, and a lineage of memory. The Saxon story ends in 1066 with Harold Godwinson's fall at Hastings, but their legacy never really left England. Like a deep root beneath the soil, the Saxons continued to nourish the land, even as Normans built castles above it. If you listen closely, you can still hear their voices in the words we speak, the laws. We follow the very sense of what it means to be English. Start with language. Old English, born of Saxon tongues, blended with a few Celtic and Latin traces, is the bedrock of English today. Half the words in our everyday speech, house bread, child friend, water earth, are Saxon. They are short, sturdy, and unpretentious, much like the people who first spoke them in timber halls and village fields. The Normans brought French scholars, used Latin, but in the end, it was the Saxon vocabulary of hearth and home that survived at the heart of English. When we say love instead of amour, king instead of aroi, we are echoing the Saxons. Law, too, carried their imprint. The Saxons gave us shires and 100 systems of local administration that lasted well beyond Norman rule. They gave us common law roots, the sense that custom and precedent mattered as much as royal decree. Even the practice of juries where free men judged disputes has a Saxon ancestor in the thing, those noisy gatherings under oak trees where neighbors thrashed out justice. The modern English obsession with fairness, rights, and due process has deep Saxon blood in it. Their society shaped English identity in ways more subtle than crowns and swords. The Saxons valued loyalty above all loyalty between lord and warrior, between kin and kin, between oath and honor. That sense of obligation bound their fragile kingdoms together and left an echo in English culture, the expectation that promises matter, that community is stitched by trust. Even today, when an English speaker mutters, "My word is my bond," they are channeling a Saxon oath swearer with his hand on his sword. Christianity, which the Saxons eventually embraced, was also refracted through their spirit. Monks copied texts and built monasteries, but they carried forward Saxon love of story and symbol. The illuminated Gospels of Lindisfarne glow with interlaced designs that feel half pagan, half Christian, a marriage of faiths. Saints like Cuthbert and Bede were revered, but the Saxon sense of weird still colored their theology. Fate and faith walked together in their imagination, creating a Christianity that was uniquely English. Their literature continues to echo across centuries. Beowulf, the Wanderer, The Exeter riddles. These are not just dusty relics. They are living voices reminding us that people 1,000 years ago wrestled with the same fears and longings we do. The Saxon imagination gave us poetry of exile songs, of loyalty, elegies of grief, and riddles that wink at human cleverness. Every English poem from Chaucer to Shakespeare to Tolkien owes a debt to that Saxon foundation. And what of their political legacy? Though the Norman conquest reshaped England, it built upon Saxon structures. The Domesday Book, that great survey of 1086, was in many ways an extension of Saxon record-keeping habits. Norman kings ruled through shires, reeves, and councils first forged in Saxon times. Even the English crown's enduring image as a law-bound monarchy, not an absolute tyranny, stems from Saxon practice where kings were expected to consult, to give gifts, and to uphold law. The Saxons also gave England a sense of place. Towns and villages across the land bear their mark in their names: Tun Farmstead, Ham Homestead, Barry Fort, Worth Enclosure. Every map of England is a Saxon memory written in ink. Walk through Kingston King's Town, Hampton Home Farm, or Birmingham Bjorma's, People's Home, and you are walking through Saxon time. The land itself still whispers their presence. Even their failures shaped England. The trauma of 1066, the loss of their dynasty, burned into memory the fragility of power. Yet because their culture was so embedded in daily life, it survived the conquest better than the Norman rulers may have wished. They lost their kingship, but they gave England its backbone. The Normans sat atop the throne, but the Saxons lived in every plow furrow, every marketplace, every parish church. Perhaps their greatest legacy is this: they took a land abandoned by Rome, fractured by raids, scarred by war, and made it a kingdom. They were not perfect, far from it. They practiced slavery. They feuded endlessly. They could be ruthless and narrow. Yet they were builders as much as destroyers, lawmakers as much as warriors, poets as much as plowmen. They carried Britain from the shadow of empire into the dawn of a new nation. So when we speak of the Saxons, we do not just speak of warriors with axes or kings with crowns. We speak of a people who, through resilience, imagination, and sheer stubbornness, laid the foundations of England. From their halls came words we still speak. From their courts came laws we still follow. From their poets came images that still stir. Their story closed in blood at Hastings, but their spirit never really left. In language, in law, in landscape, the Saxons endure. And in every English word spoken today, they live again. So here we are, at the end of the Saxon story. What began with scattered tribes in the marshes of northern Europe, gathering under oaks and swearing oaths in smoky halls, became centuries of migration, kingship, poetry, war, and faith. They were raiders who turned into settlers, settlers who became rulers, and rulers who at Hastings became memory. Yet through it all, the Saxons never truly vanished. Their shadows stretch across our words, our laws, our place, names our very sense of belonging. If you close your eyes, you can trace their journey. First the murmur of waves, and the creak of wooden ships carrying families across the North Sea. Then the clang of shields as warriors meet in battle with Britons, or later with Norsemen, each fight echoing with wired the old Saxon sense of fate. Listen closer, and you might hear the chanting of monks in Lindisfarne, the scratch of quills as Bede bends over his parchment, preserving the memory of a people. Or the riddle laughter of a farmer at a winter feast, guessing that the tall, stiff thing described by the bard is in fact just an onion. Their world was harsh, but it was also luminous. They tilled soil with calloused hands, built burrs with sweat and timber, and guarded their halls with fierce loyalty. They valued honor more than wealth, oath more than life. And yet they also sang songs, wove riddles, carved intricate designs into gold clasps, and gospel pages proving that beauty can bloom even in times of fear. When the Normans came, it seemed the Saxons had been buried under stone castles and French words. But memory is resilient. A language endures a law, survives a story is told again. Alfred still stands in our imagination in the marshes with his burned cakes. Ethelfled still rides with her Mercian army, the Lady of the Mercians. Ethelstan still sharpens his sword before Brunanburh. Harold Godwinson still lifts his eyes at Hastings, knowing Weird has finally caught up with him. And beyond the names, there are the countless ordinary Saxons, farmers, weavers, monks, mothers, slaves, who left no chronicles, but whose lives shaped the fabric of the land. Their fields became our towns, their words, our speech, their customs, our heritage. They remind us that history is not only kings and battles, but also bread-baked songs, sung prayers whispered. So when we think of the Saxons, we should not imagine only a people of shadows lost to conquest. They are still here in the way we speak, in the rhythms of English law, in the shape of the countryside. They belong not just to the past, but to the living present. And maybe that is the quiet lesson of their story, that though Weird claims us all, though halls fall silent and crowns pass away, memory endures. A people live as long as their stories are told. And the Saxons, through their poetry, their battles, their faith, and their laughter, are still being told tonight. So as you drift into sleep, picture the flicker of fire in a timber hall, a harp string trembling, a poet's voice, rising tales of heroes, of exile, of kings of monsters. Outside, the night wind sighs across the fields, just as it did 1,000 years ago. The Saxons fade into memory, but their echoes remain. And in that echo, perhaps lies a little comfort, because the past is never as far away as it seems.